The Mediterranean wind carried salt and secrets across the harbor of Alexandria, where the great lighthouse stood sentinel over a kingdom that had outlived its purpose. In the palace gardens, where marble columns caught the evening light, a child was born into a world already fading, a dynasty 3 centuries old, yet somehow ancient beyond its years. She entered history, not with thunder, but with the quiet insistence of fate, a seventh queen bearing the name Cleopatra, destined to be the last. The year was 69 BC, though some chronicles whisper it might have been 70. Precision in those final decades of the Ptolemaic line had become as elusive as loyalty. What mattered was not the exact moment, but the world into which she arrived. A palace of faded grandeur, where Greek was still spoken with Macedonian pride, where Egyptian gods were worshipped by foreign kings, and where Rome's shadow grew longer with each passing season. Alexandria in those years was a city of contradictions wrapped in beauty. Its streets stretched wide and straight, engineered with the geometric precision of Alexander's vision. Yet 300 years of Mediterranean sun had weathered their stones into something softer than ambition. The library still drew scholars from across the known world, its scrolls preserving the accumulated wisdom of centuries, though even wisdom could not answer the question that haunted every corridor of power. How much longer could Egypt remain Egypt? The Ptolemies had ruled since Alexander's general, Ptolemy son of Lagos, claimed the Nile Valley as his portion of a fractured dream. For 3 centuries, his descendants had worn the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, styled themselves pharaohs in the ancient manner, and governed from a palace that mingled Hellenic columns with Egyptian lotus capitals. They were Greeks who had become something else. Not quite Egyptian, never quite Greek, suspended between two worlds, like the city they had built at the meeting place of sea and desert. Into this inheritance, Cleopatra the seventh was born, the daughter of Ptolemy, the 12th Auletes, a king whose very nickname betrayed his predicament. Auletes, the Romans called him the flute player, a name that dripped with contempt. They mocked his love of music, his nervous energy, his transparent need for their approval. To Rome's calculating senators, he appeared less a king than a client, less a pharaoh than a dependent, useful for Egypt's grain, but unworthy of respect. He knew what they said about him in the forum, how they laughed at his lavish gifts and desperate embassies. But he also knew what they could do to kings who forgot Rome's primacy. The question of Cleopatra's mother lingered in the palace shadows like incense that has lost its scent. The official record spoke of Cleopatra V the Tryphena, a woman of the royal household, though whether by marriage or blood remained deliberately unclear. In the Ptolemaic court, where brothers married sisters to preserve the purity of Macedonian blood, such ambiguities were common as morning mist on the Nile. What mattered was legitimacy, and Cleopatra possessed that, seventh of her name, a princess of the royal house, born to the purple even if the purple had begun to fade. She was not alone in the nursery. The palace corridors echoed with the footsteps of siblings, each a potential ally or rival, each bearing the weight of a dying dynasty's hopes. Her older sister, Berenice IV, sharp-featured and ambitious, watched the court's intrigues with calculating eyes. Her younger sister, Arsinoe IV, would grow into beauty and resentment in equal measure. And there were brothers, 2 boys who would both, in the Egyptian tradition, bear the name Ptolemy, destined to be husbands, co-rulers, and eventually obstacles to their sister's survival. In this crowded royal nursery, young Cleopatra learned her first lessons in power, that family was both fortress and battlefield, that love and murder often wore the same face, and that survival required a mind sharper than any ceremonial blade. She watched her father navigate the treacherous waters between pride and pragmatism, saw how he bent without breaking, how he paid in gold and dignity for the privilege of keeping his throne. These were not the lessons of philosophy scrolls, but the education of necessity, taught in whispers and witnessed through palace windows. Her formal education, however, reached far beyond the arts of survival. The Ptolemies, for all their political decline, remained patrons of learning. Tutors arrived from across the Mediterranean, grammarians from Athens, astronomers from Babylon, philosophers trained in the peripatetic tradition. They taught her Greek, the language of her ancestors, and the tongue of culture. But unlike her predecessors, Cleopatra did something remarkable, something no Ptolemaic ruler had done in nearly 3 centuries. She learned Egyptian, the ancient language of the Nile, the sacred script carved into temple walls when Alexander was merely a name unborn, the speech of the people who farmed the black soil and worshipped gods older than Olympus. This she mastered with the dedication of someone who understood that power without connection was merely occupation. In learning Egyptian, she claimed something her father never could: the right to speak directly to the land itself, unmediated by translators or priests. She could read the hieroglyphs in the temples at Karnak, could address the priesthood in their own tongue, could whisper prayers to Isis without needing a Greek intermediary. But her linguistic gifts extended further still. She learned Latin, the language of the power that would determine her fate. She studied Hebrew and Aramaic. The tongues of the East Chronicles suggest she knew as many as 9 languages, each one a key to a different world, each one a weapon in an arsenal most rulers never thought to forge. While her siblings practiced ceremonial gestures and court etiquette, Cleopatra collected languages like other princesses collected jewels, not for display, but for use. In the palace's quiet hours, she studied philosophy beneath colonnades, where light and shadow played across marble floors. She learned the movements of stars from astronomers who charted the heavens with mathematical precision. She absorbed rhetoric, that art of persuasion the Greeks valued above force, discovering how words could accomplish what armies could not. And she observed, watching how courtiers maneuvered, how priests politicked, how her father's ministers balanced loyalty against self-preservation. The palace was her first classroom, and every conversation overheard, every alliance witnessed, every betrayal whispered, became part of her education. Already, even in childhood, there were signs of something unusual, an intelligence that moved too quickly to be satisfied with prepared answers, a poise that seemed borrowed from an older soul. When priests visited the palace to perform the ancient rites, young Cleopatra asked questions that made them pause. Questions about the nature of Ma'at, about the responsibilities of kingship, about why the gods had allowed foreigners to rule the 2 lands. These were not the idle curiosities of a sheltered princess, but the probings of a mind that refused to accept the world as given. Yet for all her gifts, she remained trapped in a kingdom slowly drowning in debt and dependency. The crisis that would define her childhood came not from enemies, but from Rome's casual contempt. In 58 BC, the Roman Senate annexed Cyprus, a possession of the Ptolemaic house for generations, an island sacred to Aphrodite, a source of copper and timber that had enriched the Egyptian treasury since before Cleopatra was born. They took it with a stroke of senatorial decree, as casually as one might seize a debtor's property. Cleopatra's uncle, who governed Cyprus for the royal house, chose death over the humiliation of surrender. He took poison rather than watch Roman officials catalogue his holdings, rather than see the royal standard lowered and replaced with the standards of the Republic. When news of his suicide reached Alexandria, the palace fell into a silence deeper than mourning. This was not merely the loss of territory or revenue. This was a demonstration of powerlessness, a public exhibition of how far the Ptolemies had fallen. Rome had taken what it wanted, and Egypt could do nothing but accept the theft. For the 10-year-old Cleopatra, Cyprus's annexation provided a brutal education in the realities of her world. No amount of ancient lineage, no claim to divine kingship, no appeals to law or custom mattered. When power shifted, Rome did not need permission. It needed only will and opportunity. The lesson burned itself into her memory. Survival in this new world order required more than legitimacy. It required leverage, cunning, and the ability to make oneself indispensable. Her father understood this perhaps too well. Arletes had spent years cultivating Roman senators, distributing bribes with the desperation of a man trying to buy time itself. He knew that the Republic's appetite was insatiable, that today's ally might be tomorrow's conqueror, that the grain ships sailing from Alexandria to Rome bound Egypt in chains disguised as commerce. The Ptolemaic kingdom had become what it had never been in the days of the first Ptolemy, a client state, its independence theoretical, its sovereignty conditional on Roman tolerance. Around the palace, whispers grew like weeds in untended gardens. Courtiers murmured that the king had paid too much, bent too low, surrendered too readily. The Alexandrian mob, that volatile mixture of Greeks, Egyptians, and migrants from every shore of the Mediterranean, began to gather in the agora, their voices rising in the particular rhythm of discontent that presaged revolution. They had endured taxation to pay for the king's bribes to Rome, had watched their island possessions seized without resistance, had seen their pharaoh transformed into a supplicant patience. That virtue of the powerless was exhausting itself. In the palace gardens, where she had played as a young child, Cleopatra now walked with the awareness that childhood was ending, not by her choice, but by necessity. The scent of jasmine still perfumed the evening air, and the fountain still murmured its ancient music, but the world beyond the palace walls had begun to shift. Change approached, not with the drama of conquest, but with the quiet persistence of tide against shore, inevitable and unstoppable. She did not yet know that within months her father would be driven from his throne, that she would watch power transfer to her older sister, that exile would teach her lessons no tutor could provide. She did not yet know that Rome's civil wars would eventually bring a general named Caesar to Alexandria's harbour, or that her own intelligence, cultivated in these quiet years of childhood, would become the only weapon capable of preserving her kingdom. She knew only that the dynasty into which she had been born was dying, and that dynasties do not die quietly. The lighthouse still burned at the harbour's mouth, its fire visible for miles across the dark Mediterranean, a beacon that had guided ships through 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. But beacons, however bright, cannot illuminate what is already lost. In the palace where Cleopatra learned languages and philosophy, where she absorbed the arts of both Greek culture and Egyptian tradition, where she prepared for a future she could not yet imagine, the only certainty was uncertainty itself. The dying dynasty had produced one last child of consequence, one final player in a game whose rules were changing even as it was played. She was neither the firstborn nor the favoured, neither the most beautiful nor the most obviously suited for power. But in the education she received, in the mind she cultivated, in the determination that would define her life, Cleopatra possessed something her siblings lacked: the capacity to adapt to a world that no longer rewarded the things that had made the Ptolemies great. As the sun set over Alexandria, casting long shadows across marble and limestone, across palace and library, across the city that had been built to be eternal, but had learned the hard lessons of impermanence, the young princess stood at a threshold she could not yet recognize. Behind her lay the certainty of childhood, however troubled. Before her stretched a path that would lead through exile and war, love and loss, triumph and tragedy, to a throne that was already more memory than power. The wind from the harbour carried salt and secrets, and in the palace gardens, where dynasties dreamed of immortality, a girl who would become the last queen of Egypt prepared for storms she did not yet know were gathering. The world was changing, and she would have to change with it, or be swept away by the same tide that was already eroding the foundations of everything her family had built. In that moment of twilight, in that kingdom suspended between past and future, Cleopatra's childhood ended not with ceremony, but with the quiet recognition that survival would require more than birthright. It would require transformation. The nurses called her in from the garden as darkness fell, but she lingered a moment longer, watching the lighthouse flame dance against the deepening blue. Somewhere beyond that horizon, in the marble forums of Rome, men were deciding Egypt's fate without consulting its rulers. Somewhere in the palace, her father worried over debts that could never be fully paid. Somewhere in the city, the mob's patience was running thin. The dying dynasty had borne its last queen, though no one yet knew she would be last. In the breath between what was and what would be, in the space where childhood gives way to history, Cleopatra stood watching the light fade, unaware that she was already becoming the woman who would defy Rome, captivate its greatest generals, and die by her own hand, rather than surrender the crown that was hers by blood and will. The first chapter of her story closed in gathering darkness, and the next would open in exile and uncertainty. But for now, in this moment of twilight peace, she was simply a child of a fading house, educated beyond her years, watching the last light of day surrender to the approaching night. The storm that had been gathering in Alexandria's streets finally broke in the winter of 58 BC, and when it did, the palace trembled. The mob that had murmured discontent now roared demands, their voices echoing through the agora and up the marble steps of the royal quarter. They wanted their king gone, the flute player who had bankrupted the treasury to buy Roman favor, who had surrendered Cyprus without a fight, who had turned the throne of the Ptolemies into a stool for begging. The anger that swept through Alexandria was not the calculated fury of politicians, but the raw frustration of a people who had watched their kingdom diminish year by year, coin by coin, humiliation by humiliation. Ptolemy, Auletes, fled his own capital like a thief escaping judgment. In the confusion of those winter days, with the mob at the gates and his own guards uncertain where their loyalty lay, he gathered what treasure he could carry and what family members would follow. Among them, sometimes, was his daughter Cleopatra, 12 years old, watching her father's kingship dissolve like salt in the Nile. The girl who had studied philosophy in marble halls now learned a harder curriculum: the fragility of power, the fickleness of crowds, and the cold mathematics of political survival. They sailed north and west, beyond the reach of Alexandrian fury, carrying with them the portable wealth of a desperate monarch. The journey took them first to Rhodes, where Auletes sought temporary sanctuary, then onward to Rome itself, the city whose favor he had spent a fortune courting, the republic whose protection was now his only hope of restoration. For young Cleopatra, if she accompanied him during these wandering months, It was an education no palace tutor could provide. She saw how power truly worked, not through the ancient claims of bloodline or the ceremonial weight of double crowns, but through gold, promises, and the calculated self-interest of ambitious men. Rome in the late 50s BC was itself a cauldron of ambition, barely contained by republican forms. The old constitution still functioned, senators still debated, magistrates still held office. But beneath the familiar rituals, something fundamental had shifted. Power was drifting from institutions to individuals, to generals who commanded legions, to wealthy men who could buy votes, to political coalitions that cared more for dominance than for law. Into this world of barely civilized competition came a desperate king with a simple proposition: restore me to my throne, and Egypt's wealth will flow to those who help. Auletes moved through Rome's political circles like a merchant in a bazaar, negotiating with whoever would listen. He cultivated Pompey the Great, the general whose victories had made him wealthy beyond measure and powerful beyond comfort. He courted Crassus, whose fortune made Pompey's wealth seem modest, whose appetite for more was insatiable. He paid vast sums to Julius Caesar, the charming patrician whose debts were legendary and whose ambitions were limitless. The bribes he distributed could have built temples, fed cities, equipped armies. Instead, they purchased the promise of restoration, that most expensive of commodities. For Cleopatra, watching these transactions, if indeed she was present to witness them, the lessons were clear and brutal. The Senate that had casually annexed Cyprus was the same Senate that now negotiated the price of her father's throne. The Republic that spoke endlessly of virtue and law operated on bribery so routine it had become bureaucratic. Rome's power did not flow from its ideals, but from its legions and its appetite. And those who wished to survive in Rome's world needed to understand that distinction. The sum Auletes promised was staggering: 10,000 talents, a figure so vast that it represented years of Egypt's revenue. To secure this loan, he mortgaged his kingdom to Roman moneylenders, signed promissory notes that turned Egypt into a debtor nation, and pledged the future tax revenues of the Nile to foreign creditors. It was perhaps the most expensive bribe in history, and it worked. The Senate, or at least the powerful men who controlled it, agreed to support his restoration. Aulus Gabinius, the governor of Syria, received orders, purchased rather than issued, to march south with Roman legions and return the exiled pharaoh to his throne. While her father wandered in exile and negotiated in Rome, Alexandria adapted to new authority. Berenice IV, Cleopatra's older sister, had seized the throne with the backing of Alexandrian nobles who preferred any Ptolemy to none. She acted quickly to legitimize her rule, seeking marriage alliances that would strengthen her claim. The chronicles speak of her attempts to find suitable royal consorts, princes from neighboring kingdoms, men whose bloodlines might add legitimacy to a crown seized in her father's absence. The palace that Cleopatra had left continued to function. The administration still collected taxes. The fleet still guarded the harbors. But the throne's occupant had changed, and with it, the court's calculations of where power lay. Back in Rome, the machinery of restoration turned slowly but inexorably. Gold flowed into senatorial coffers. Promises were exchanged in the forum's porticos, and by 55 BC, the pieces were in place. Gabinius marched from Syria with his legions, efficient, disciplined Roman soldiers who cared nothing for Egyptian politics, but everything for Roman pay. The force that accompanied them was sufficient not to conquer Egypt, which would have been unnecessary, but to intimidate it, which was all Auletes required. His restoration would come not through popular acclaim, but through Roman arms, not through justice, but through purchased force. When Auletes' ships appeared in Alexandria's harbour, with Gabinius's legions behind them, resistance collapsed before it could properly form. The city that had driven out the king now opened its gates to him, not from love, but from the recognition that Roman swords had settled the argument. Berenice's brief reign ended as swiftly as it had begun. There was no trial, no elaborate ceremony of justice, only execution, carried out with the brutal efficiency of a dynasty that had learned to treat family as it treated enemies. The older sister who had claimed the throne was killed, her supporters scattered, and Auletes returned to the palace he had fled, his authority now guaranteed by foreign soldiers, and paid for with debts that would haunt Egypt for years to come. Cleopatra returned to a city that remembered defeat. She was perhaps 14 now, no longer the child who had studied languages in palace gardens, but a young woman who had witnessed how kingdoms were bartered in Roman forums, how power was measured in talents of silver rather than years of lineage, how the ancient dignity of pharaohs meant nothing when legions decided otherwise. The education she had received in exile complemented what she had learned in Alexandria. Together they formed a complete understanding of her world's new rules. The palace to which she returned was both familiar and transformed. The same marble halls, the same colonnades where she had studied rhetoric, the same gardens where fountains played their eternal music. Yet everything felt different, tainted by the knowledge of fragility. Her father's throne was no longer the seat of power, but a chair borrowed from Rome, held in place by debts and dependencies that could never be fully repaid. The restoration had been purchased, not earned, and everyone in Alexandria knew the price. Auletes ruled his remaining years under the weight of those debts. The 10,000 talents he had promised haunted every decision. Taxes increased, pressing hard on farmers who worked the black soil of the delta. The harvest was no longer simply the measure of Egypt's prosperity, but the means of servicing obligations to foreign creditors. Roman businessmen, publicani, tax farmers who had bought the right to collect revenue, moved through Egypt with the confidence of men who held contracts signed by the king himself. They squeezed the provinces, extracting every coin the treaty permitted, and sometimes more than it allowed. Through these years of her adolescence, Cleopatra watched and learned. She saw how her father's restoration had transformed him from king to client, how the independence he had tried to preserve through bribery had been lost in the very act of preserving it. She watched Roman soldiers garrison Egyptian cities, their presence a constant reminder of who truly held power. She observed the courtiers who had served Berenice now bend the knee to her father, their loyalty as flexible as their survival instincts demanded. Every lesson reinforced the same conclusion. In this new world, legitimacy without power was merely decoration, and tradition without adaptation was suicide. Her education continued, now enriched by observation of statecraft in its rawest form. She studied not just what her tutors taught, but what the court revealed, how alliances shifted, how ministers maneuvered, how her father balanced between asserting authority and acknowledging dependence. She learned to read the silences between words, to understand what men sought when they spoke of duty, to recognize ambition dressed in the language of loyalty. These were lessons no scroll contained, taught in the gaps between official pronouncements and private conversations. The years between her father's restoration and his death passed in this atmosphere of managed decline. Auletes had won back his throne, but lost Egypt's autonomy in the process. The kingdom functioned, trade continued. The harvest came and went, But the underlying reality had shifted permanently. Egypt was no longer a power negotiating with Rome as an equal, but a dependent territory whose pharaoh ruled at Rome's sufferance. The Nile still flooded on its ancient schedule. The temples still honored the gods, but the calendar that truly mattered was now measured in debt payments and Roman approval. As Cleopatra approached womanhood, her father's health began to fail. The years of stress, the humiliation of exile, the constant pressure of obligations he could never fully meet, all of these carved themselves into his body. He grew frailer, his flute playing less frequent, his attention to ceremony more sporadic. The court watched this decline with the calculating patience of those who must prepare for what comes next. Succession, that perpetual anxiety of monarchies, began to occupy the whispers in palace corridors. Ptolemaic tradition was clear. The kingdom would pass to royal children, but custom demanded that a queen rule alongside a king, that power be shared between male and female, even when, as was often the case, one partner dominated the other. Cleopatra was now the eldest surviving daughter, educated beyond any of her siblings, marked by exile and restoration, prepared by circumstances her brothers and remaining sister had not experienced. The law would give her a claim to the throne, but the law had never been sufficient in the Ptolemaic court. Power required allies, resources, and the ability to outmaneuver rivals who shared your blood. In 51 BC, as winter approached and the Nile's waters receded to reveal the rich black soil that was Egypt's eternal gift, Ptolemy XII, or let's died, the flute player who had bought his throne from Rome, who had witnessed his kingdom's transformation from power to client state, who had seen Cyprus seized and his own daughter executed, breathed his last in the palace that had never quite been home after his exile. His death was noted in the usual manner, mourning prescribed by ceremony, religious rites performed with ancient precision, a funeral that acknowledged both the Egyptian and Greek aspects of his hybrid kingship. His will, read before the assembled court and sent in copy to Rome, where such things were now reviewed, named his successors, Cleopatra, approximately 18 years old, and her younger brother, Ptolemy, the 13th, barely 10. They would rule together, as tradition demanded, married to each other in the ancient Egyptian manner that preserved bloodline purity, even as it shocked Greek sensibility. The double kingdom would have double rulers. The two lands would be governed by two siblings, and the court would serve a queen and a king, whose relationship combined family, politics, and the peculiar customs of a dynasty that had always operated by its own rules. As the priests prepared her father's body for its journey to the royal tombs, as the courtiers adjusted their calculations to account for new rulers, as the Roman officials in Egypt sent dispatches north reporting the change in leadership, Cleopatra stood at a threshold more significant than palace gates. Behind her lay the education of childhood and exile, the lessons of languages and power, the understanding of how the world truly worked beneath its ceremonial surface. Before her stretched the burden of rule in a kingdom that was no longer quite sovereign, the challenge of maintaining dignity in circumstances that demanded compromise, the necessity of proving that intelligence could substitute for the power Egypt had lost. The lighthouse at Alexandria Harbour still burned its nightly warning and welcome, its flame visible across the dark Mediterranean waters, where Roman ships carried grain to feed the Republic's hungry masses. In the palace where she now sat, no longer as princess but as queen, Cleopatra prepared to navigate waters more treacherous than any sea. She was queen of Egypt, but Egypt was Rome's dependent. She was pharaoh, but the office had been hollowed out by debt and defeat. She was 18, female, and ruling alongside a child brother whose regents would have their own ideas about who truly held power. The dying dynasty had produced its last queen, though she did not yet know she would be last. What she knew was simpler and more immediate. She had survived childhood, exile, and restoration. She had learned languages that would let her speak to her people, to Rome's generals, to the scholars who still filled Alexandria's libraries. She had studied the mechanics of power in both Egyptian temples and Roman forums. And now, as the winter rains began and the Mediterranean grew rough with seasonal storms, she prepared to rule a kingdom that existed in the gap between its glorious past and its uncertain future. The transition from princess to queen came not with triumph, but with sober recognition of challenges ahead. The court assembled, oaths were sworn. The double crown was placed upon her head in ceremonies that mingled Greek pageantry with Egyptian tradition. And in that moment, as the priests intoned ancient blessings and the courtiers calculated their positions in the new order, Cleopatra became what her education had prepared her to be, a ruler who would need every advantage, every language learned, every lesson absorbed, every understanding gained, to preserve what remained of her family's kingdom. The storms that had driven her father into exile had passed, but others were gathering on horizons she could not yet see. In Rome, the Republic was tearing itself apart in civil wars that would soon spill across the Mediterranean. In the palace, rivals were already preparing to challenge her authority. In the world beyond Alexandria's walls, the future was being written by forces larger than any single kingdom, however ancient its claims. But for now, in this moment, between one reign's end and another's beginning, in this pause before storms that would reshape the world, Cleopatra stood as Queen of Egypt, young, brilliant, prepared by circumstances to rule in circumstances that would test everything she had learned. The dying dynasty had passed its burden to her, and she had accepted it with the sober awareness that crowns, in her world, were not gifts, but wages earned through constant vigilance, endless adaptation, and the understanding that survival was never certain, only sometimes possible. The wind from the harbour carried salt and the scent of coming change. And in the palace where generations of Ptolemies had ruled and schemed and died, the last queen prepared for a reign that would require more than legitimacy, it would require genius. The crown settled onto Cleopatra's head with the weight of 3 centuries and the lightness of illusion. She was queen, the decrees proclaimed it, the priests blessed it, the court acknowledged it, yet in the palace corridors, other calculations were already being made. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was 10 years old, a child who should have been learning arithmetic and grammar, not ruling a kingdom, but in the Ptolemaic tradition, he was king nonetheless. And around him gathered men who understood that a child king was a perfect instrument for those who wished to rule without wearing a crown. 3 names came to dominate the palace in those early months of joint rule. Pothinus, the eunuch who served as chief minister, his voice soft but his ambitions sharp as Syrian steel. Achilles, the general whose loyalty was to his own advancement, and whose soldiers answered to his commands rather than royal decrees. And Theodotus, the rhetoric tutor who had taught young Ptolemy to speak, but had also taught him whom to obey. These 3 saw in the boy king a future they could shape, and in Cleopatra they saw an obstacle, talented, educated, and dangerously capable of independent thought. The first signs of trouble came subtly, as palace conflicts always do. Documents that once listed Cleopatra's name first now bore Ptolemy's name in precedence. Decrees issued in the queen's voice required counter-signatures that delayed their effect. Audiences she had scheduled were mysteriously rescheduled. Appointments she had made were quietly countermanded. The machinery of government, that intricate mechanism of scribes and seals and ceremonies, began to turn away from her command and toward the regents who controlled her brother. Cleopatra responded not with confrontation, but with assertion. She insisted on her presence at all major decisions, attended every audience where policy was made, and made her intelligence so obvious that ignoring her became impossible. Where her brother Ptolemy read from prepared statements, she engaged in discussion, asking questions that revealed she understood the issues better than the men advising him. When ambassadors visited from Syrian kingdoms or Arabian tribes, she addressed them in their own languages, a gesture that impressed visitors even as it irritated the regents who could not match her facility. But intelligence, however dazzling, could not overcome the structural problem. Her brother controlled the army through Achilles, controlled the treasury through Pothinus, and controlled the ceremonial apparatus through advisors who saw him as malleable and her as threatening. In the delicate balance of power between a capable queen and a boy king managed by ambitious men, capability was becoming a liability. The kingdom they quarreled over, meanwhile, faced challenges that cared nothing for palace politics. The Nile, that eternal rhythm to which all Egyptian life danced, had begun to fail. For 2 consecutive years, the flood ran low, the waters not rising to their expected height, the black soil not spreading its usual fertility across the floodplain. Famine crept through the delta and upper Egypt, quiet at first, then insistent. Grain supplies dwindled, bread prices rose, and the people who had endured taxation for Roman debts now faced hunger as well. Cleopatra understood that famine was not merely a natural disaster, but a political test. She personally supervised grain distribution in Alexandria, ensuring that the warehouses opened and the hungry were fed, turning crisis into an opportunity to demonstrate her care for subjects who might otherwise see her as merely another distant ruler. She inspected the irrigation works, consulted with priests who kept the ancient records of flood patterns, and ordered that what grain remained be distributed fairly rather than sold to the highest bidder. These were actions that built loyalty among common Egyptians, but they also antagonized the court faction that controlled her brother, men who saw the treasury as a resource to be preserved for their own purposes, not spent on commoners. The religious dimension of her rule mattered more in Egypt than it ever could have in a Greek kingdom. Unlike her father and grandfather, who had gone through the motions of Egyptian ritual without fully embracing it, Cleopatra performed the ancient ceremonies with something approaching genuine devotion. She learned the rites, studied the theology, and presented herself not just as a Greek monarch who happened to rule Egypt, but as pharaoh in the old sense, the living Horus, the daughter of Ra, the earthly representative of divine order. When she appeared in Egyptian temples, she wore Egyptian dress and spoke Egyptian words, while in Alexandria's Greek quarters, she remained the Hellenistic queen, graceful and educated. This ability to be both, to move between identities as circumstances required, became one of her greatest strengths. But by the 2nd year of her reign, the political tensions that had simmered beneath ceremonial courtesy began to boil over. Documents began appearing with Ptolemy XIII's name alone, as though Cleopatra had never been co-ruler at all. Her image was removed from certain coins, her presence excluded from major religious ceremonies. The regents who controlled her brother had decided that the fiction of joint rule was no longer convenient. They wanted a pharaoh they could fully control, and Cleopatra's competence had made her impossible to manage. The conflict came to a head not through open confrontation, but through the slow squeeze of exclusion. Cleopatra found herself progressively shut out of governance, her orders ignored, her audiences limited, her access to her brother restricted. The palace that had been her home became hostile territory, every corridor potentially dangerous, every conversation monitored by those who now saw her as rival rather than partner. By 49 BC, the situation had become untenable. Her brother's regents made their final calculation. The kingdom would be simpler with only one ruler, and that ruler would be the boy they controlled. Cleopatra fled before she could be imprisoned or worse. She did not flee in panic, but with purpose, taking with her loyal supporters and whatever portable wealth she could secure. She moved south through Egypt and then east into Syria, beyond the reach of Achilles' soldiers, beyond the borders of a kingdom that was now fully controlled by those who had usurped her authority. Exile at 19, driven from a throne by men who served her own brother. It was a repetition of her father's fate. But unlike him, she had no Roman legions to purchase, no vast bribes to distribute. What she had was herself, her intelligence, her languages, her understanding of power, and her absolute determination to reclaim what had been stolen. In Syria, she did what exiled rulers have always done. She gathered an army. Not the disciplined legions of Rome, not the permanent forces of established kingdoms, but an improvised force of mercenaries, adventurers, and loyalists who still believed in her claim. She recruited among the Arab tribes, negotiated with Syrian princes, and assembled a force sufficient not to conquer Egypt, but to challenge the legitimacy of her brother's sole rule. By the summer of 48 BC, she had moved this ragtag army to Egypt's eastern frontier, near the fortress of Pelusium, preparing to march on a kingdom that was rightfully hers. The standoff that followed might have descended into civil war, brother against sister, army against army. But history intervened in the form of Rome's own conflicts. While Cleopatra gathered her forces and Ptolemy's regents fortified their position, the Roman Republic tore itself apart in a civil war between two men whose rivalry would reshape the Mediterranean world. Pompey the Great, the general who had helped restore her father, and Julius Caesar, the charismatic patrician whose ambitions had finally exceeded the Republic's tolerance. At Pharsalus, in Greece, Caesar defeated Pompey decisively, shattering the larger army through superior tactics and the loyalty of veterans who would follow him into any battle. Pompey fled the field, his dreams of continued dominance dissolving in the dust of defeat. He needed sanctuary, a place to regroup, gather new forces, and perhaps negotiate peace from a position that was not total ruin. He chose Egypt, the kingdom his own actions had once helped preserve, the land that owed its current dynasty to his earlier intervention. With a small fleet and diminished escort, he sailed toward Alexandria, hoping that the Ptolemies would remember their debt. But the men who controlled Ptolemy the 13th were not sentimental about debts of gratitude. Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus gathered to discuss this unexpected visitor. If they welcomed Pompey, they might offend Caesar. If they turned him away, they might offend Rome itself. The solution they reached was born from pragmatism twisted into cruelty. They would welcome Pompey with apparent honor, then kill him and present his head to Caesar as proof of their support for the victor. It was the sort of calculation that men who live by manipulation find logical, the kind of decision that ignores honor in favor of perceived advantage. On September 28th, 48 BC, Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian coast near Pelusium. A small boat rowed out to meet him, carrying Egyptian officials who welcomed him in the name of the young king and invited him to come ashore. Pompey, weary from flight and perhaps relieved to find sanctuary, accepted. He stepped from his ship into the small boat, accompanied by only a few men. As the boat neared the shore, Achilles and his companions struck. Swords flashed in the Egyptian sun, and Pompey the Great, consul of Rome, conqueror of the East, member of the triumvirate that had dominated the Republic, died in the shallows of Egypt with his wife watching helplessly from the ship that had carried him to this fate. They cut off his head, preserved it in the Egyptian manner, and sealed it along with his signet ring to present to Caesar when he arrived. The body they left on the beach, unburied, treated with less ceremony than a common criminal would receive. What they thought would be cunning would soon reveal itself as catastrophic misjudgment, the kind of error that men drunk on their own cleverness make when they forget that murder has consequences beyond mere elimination of problems. Within days, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his defeated rival, expecting either to accept Pompey's surrender or to continue the chase. Instead, the young Ptolemy's regents presented him with Pompey's severed head, expecting gratitude or at least approval. They had eliminated Caesar's enemy, had demonstrated their support for the victor, had performed what they imagined to be a service. Caesar's reaction shattered their calculations. He wept, whether from genuine grief for a man who had once been his ally and son-in-law, or from rage that Egyptians had dared to murder a Roman consul, or from political theatre designed to demonstrate magnanimity. No chronicle records with certainty. But his response was unmistakable. He was not pleased. The general who entered Alexandria in October 48 BC brought with him only a small force, perhaps 3,000 soldiers, enough for personal security but not for conquest. He came not as conqueror, but as executor of Aurelius's will, which had been deposited in Rome and which named him arbiter of Egyptian succession disputes. The will had specified that Cleopatra and Ptolemy should rule jointly, and Caesar now took it upon himself to enforce this provision. He installed himself in the royal palace, declared that he would mediate between the feuding siblings, and summoned both to appear before him. Ptolemy XIII was already in the palace, controlled by the men who had murdered Pompey. Cleopatra was at Pelusium with her army, 40 miles away and separated from the capital by forces loyal to her brother. The summons reached her through intermediaries, and she faced a decision that would determine everything. She could march with her army and risk open warfare with Caesar as witness, or she could find another way to reach the Roman general who now held her fate in his hands. What happened next became legend, the story polished and embellished by generations of storytellers until truth and myth became impossible to separate. The accounts agree on essentials. Cleopatra arranged to be smuggled into Alexandria and into the palace itself, bypassing her brother's guards and arriving unannounced in Caesar's presence. Some chronicles claim she was wrapped in a carpet or bedding, delivered as an innocuous package that, when unrolled, revealed the queen. Others suggest a more dignified but equally clandestine approach, hidden perhaps in a delivery of goods that aroused no suspicion. The method mattered less than the audacity. While her brother waited on ceremony and her enemies controlled the palace gates, she found a way to reach the one man whose decision would determine Egypt's future. When she emerged before Caesar, young, intelligent, speaking fluent Latin without a trace of accent, she presented not supplication, but partnership. She was the rightful queen, she argued, driven out by usurpers who served a child king, and who had just demonstrated their political wisdom by murdering a Roman consul. She could speak to him without interpreters, could discuss philosophy and politics, could demonstrate that she understood the world beyond Egypt's borders, and perhaps most importantly, she could offer what Caesar always valued, an elegant solution to a complicated problem. Caesar saw in her not merely a beautiful woman, though later chroniclers would emphasize that aspect, but an opportunity. Here was a ruler who spoke his language literally and figuratively, who understood Roman politics, who could govern Egypt effectively rather than merely reign ceremonially. The alternative was the boy king, controlled by men who had already shown catastrophically poor judgment. For a general who needed Egypt's grain to feed his armies and its wealth to fund his campaigns, the choice was not difficult. He decided to enforce Orletz's will. Both siblings would rule jointly, as had been intended. It was a decision that satisfied law and appeared to honor tradition, but everyone in the palace understood its real meaning. Caesar had chosen Cleopatra, and his soldiers would ensure that choice was respected. The men who controlled Ptolemy XIII saw their careful construction of power beginning to crumble, and in the desperation of men who have gambled everything and see the dice falling against them, they chose war. Alexandria erupted in violence. Achilles, commanding the royal army, turned his forces against Caesar's small garrison. The Alexandrian mob, stirred by anti-Roman sentiment and by agents of the young king's faction, filled the streets with fury. What had seemed a simple arbitration of succession became a siege, with Caesar and Cleopatra trapped in the royal quarter of the palace, surrounded by hostile forces, cut off from reinforcement, dependent on the courage of 3,000 legionaries to hold against an entire city's rage. The Alexandrian War had begun, and with it came destruction that would scar the city for generations. In the chaos of street fighting and naval battles in the harbor, fires spread, whether set by Caesar's forces to deny the Egyptian fleet its ships, or by accident in the confusion of combat, no one could say with certainty. The flames reached the harbor district, where warehouses stood filled with papyrus scrolls and manuscripts, part of the great library of Alexandria, repository of 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge, burned. How much was lost remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest only a warehouse near the docks. Others claim greater devastation. But any loss from that collection was a wound to human learning. For months, the conflict ground on. Caesar's men fortified their position, holding the royal palace and the causeway to the lighthouse island. Reinforcements trickled in from Syria and Asia Minor, but slowly, always too slowly. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, escaped the palace and joined the forces opposing Caesar, briefly proclaimed as rival queen by those who opposed her older sister's alliance with Rome. The family that had already torn itself apart in succession struggles now fought openly, sister against sister, brothers' supporters against brothers' enemies, with a Roman general as both catalyst and prize. In the winter of 48 to 47 BC, the siege tightened and loosened by turns. Caesar's military genius kept his small force alive against overwhelming numbers, but genius required luck, and luck was finite. He fought street by street, burned what he could not hold, and waited for the reinforcements he had summoned from every corner of his growing empire. Cleopatra remained with him throughout, her fate now entirely bound to his survival, her claim to the throne dependent on Roman swords holding the palace corridors. The war's climax came at the Nile. Ptolemy XIII's forces, grown confident from months of stalemate, engaged Caesar in open battle. The boy king himself was present, or so the accounts claim, watching as his army pressed the attack. But Caesar's veterans, even outnumbered, fought with the discipline that had conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey. When the Egyptian lines broke, panic spread faster than any cavalry charge. Men drowned trying to cross the river, armor dragging them into the muddy waters. Among those who died was Ptolemy XIII himself, his body later found in the Nile, weighed down by the golden armor that should have protected a king, but instead became his death shroud. The war ended as decisively as it had begun. Achilles was dead, Pothinus executed, the resistance shattered. Arsinoe, captured by Caesar's forces, would be taken to Rome and paraded in Caesar's triumph before being exiled to Ephesus, a humiliation for a Ptolemaic princess, though Caesar would later show her the mercy of life. Alexandria, battered and burned, opened its gates not in welcome but in exhaustion. Cleopatra stood as undisputed queen, but the price of that position was impossible to ignore. She ruled by Caesar's decision and through Caesar's swords. The kingdom her family had governed for 3 centuries now survived as a Roman protectorate in all but name, its independence theoretical, its sovereignty conditional on the favor of the man who had chosen her. Yet she had survived where her brother had not, had won where others had failed, and had demonstrated that intelligence and daring could sometimes substitute for the power Egypt had lost. By tradition, she could not rule alone. Ptolemaic custom demanded a male co-regent. Her younger brother, perhaps 12 years old, was brought from the palace nurseries and proclaimed Ptolemy the 14th. He would be king in name, husband in ceremony. But everyone understood that Cleopatra alone truly ruled. The double crown sat on her head, but the authority behind it was hers. And there was one more consequence of these violent months, one that would echo through the rest of her life and beyond. In 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy, the 15th Caesarion, Little Caesar. The father's identity was proclaimed in the name itself, though Caesar never officially acknowledged him as heir. The child was both Prince of Egypt and, if his mother's claim was true, the only biological son of Julius Caesar, the man who was transforming the Roman Republic into something it had never been meant to be. The victory was complete, but victories in Alexandria were never simple. Cleopatra had her throne, her kingdom, and her son, but she held them all at the pleasure of a Roman general whose destiny was still unfolding. Beyond the palace walls, the city nursed its wounds and counted its losses. The lighthouse still burned at the harbour mouth, guiding ships to a port that would never again belong solely to Egypt. In the aftermath of war, as winter turned to spring and the Nile began its annual rise, Caesar and Cleopatra made a journey together, a voyage up the Nile in the royal barge, a procession designed to show Egypt's people their queen secure in her power and her Roman ally content in his support. The journey was politics and perhaps something more, but it served its purpose, stabilizing the kingdom, demonstrating continuity, allowing the wounds of civil war to begin their slow healing. When Caesar finally departed for Rome in the spring of 47 BC, leaving behind a garrison to ensure Cleopatra's security, Egypt entered a strange new phase. The queen ruled absolutely, her brother husband a ceremonial presence. The country was at peace, but it was the peace of a protectorate. The harvest came, the taxes flowed, the administration functioned. Yet everyone understood that the true capital of power lay across the Mediterranean in Rome, where Caesar was even now preparing for his next campaigns. Cleopatra had survived her first challenge as queen, survived her brother's betrayal, the regent's conspiracy, the siege of Alexandria, and the chaos of civil war. She had emerged victorious but bound, powerful but dependent, queen of an ancient kingdom that was no longer quite sovereign. At 21, she ruled Egypt with intelligence and determination, but she ruled it under the shadow of Rome's eagles and in the wake of Caesar's favor. The girl who had studied languages and philosophy had become a queen who survived through cunning and courage. The education that began in palace gardens had been completed in the fire of war, and now, as the young queen looked out from her palace over the city that had burned and been restored, she understood what her father had learned too late, that Egypt's future would be written not in Alexandria but in Rome, and that survival required more than ancient claims. It required making oneself indispensable to those who held real power. The storms had passed, but others were gathering. Caesar's civil war was not finished, and Rome's transformation had barely begun. Cleopatra's reign had survived its first test, but that test would prove merely preparation for challenges she could not yet imagine, loves she had not yet felt, and choices that would determine not only her fate, but the fate of the world she knew. The royal barge that carried them up the Nile was a floating palace, its gilded prow catching the morning sun, its purple sails billowing in the river breeze. For weeks they travelled through the heart of Egypt, Caesar and Cleopatra, while the kingdom watched its queen pass in the company of the Roman who had secured her throne. The journey was spectacle and statecraft combined, a demonstration that Egypt remained Egypt despite the foreign soldiers in its garrisons, that the Ptolemaic line endured despite the bloodshed that had nearly extinguished it, and that Cleopatra ruled not as Rome's puppet, but as pharaoh in her own right, simply wise enough to recognize where power truly lay. They stopped at temples where priests performed ceremonies older than Rome itself, where hieroglyphs carved by forgotten hands proclaimed eternal truths. Caesar, the practical general who measured the world in legions and territory, found himself guest to rituals that predated his republic by millennia. Cleopatra, fluent in the ancient language her Greek ancestors had disdained to learn, translated not merely words but contexts, explaining how the rhythm of Egyptian kingship moved to different measures than Roman consulships, how divine order and earthly rule intertwined in ways that Greek philosophy and Roman law had never quite captured. The weeks on the Nile allowed them both to step outside the urgent demands of war and politics into a space where something beyond calculation might grow. Caesar was 52, a man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and defeated Pompey, yet who still sought something his victories had not provided. Cleopatra was 21, brilliant beyond her years, ruling a kingdom whose greatness lay mostly in memory, yet determined to preserve what she could through any means necessary. What developed between them, whether genuine affection or mutual convenience or some mixture impossible to separate, would shape both their futures and the future of the Mediterranean world. For Cleopatra, the alliance with Caesar offered more than physical safety or political support. It offered education in a different kind of power, the power of personality that could bend institutions, of charisma that could command legions, of vision that could reimagine republics into empires. Caesar was unlike the cautious senators who had negotiated with her father, unlike the careful bureaucrats who managed Rome's provinces. He was force personified, ambition undisguised, genius married to will. To study him was to understand how individuals could redirect the course of history, how old orders could be swept away by men who simply refused to accept that certain things were impossible. And for Caesar, Cleopatra represented something equally valuable, a model of absolute rule that functioned without apology, a kingdom where power was concentrated rather than divided, where the pretense of republican forms need not constrain royal will. Egypt showed him what Rome might become if the old constitution's corpse was finally buried, an authority vested in a single capable hand. The queen who ruled beside him on that barge was not merely beautiful or intelligent. She was a vision of governance freed from the Senate's endless debates and the people's fickle moods. When the journey ended and Caesar departed Egypt in the spring of 47 BC, he left behind more than a garrison to protect Cleopatra's throne. He left behind a kingdom stabilized but dependent, a queen secure but bound, and a child growing in her womb whose parentage would never be officially acknowledged but never seriously doubted. Caesarion, little Caesar, was born later that year, a son who carried in his blood the mingling of Rome's future and Egypt's past, though neither lineage would ultimately save him. Cleopatra ruled the years following Caesar's departure, with the authority of someone who had survived civil war and emerged victorious. She was no longer the 18-year-old driven into exile by her brother's regents, no longer the desperate claimant smuggled into the palace in a carpet. She was Queen of Egypt, mother of a prince, ally of Rome's most powerful general. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, remained co-ruler in name, appearing at ceremonies and signing decrees, but no one mistook ceremonial presence for actual power. The kingdom functioned through Cleopatra's decisions, administered by officials who answered to her, guided by policies she determined. The challenges she faced were those of any ruler governing a kingdom still recovering from war, restoring order, managing finances, feeding populations, maintaining the delicate balance between Egyptian tradition and Hellenistic innovation that had always defined Ptolemaic rule. The war had disrupted trade, destroyed property, and killed or displaced thousands. The treasury, already burdened by her father's debts to Rome, now faced additional strains from reconstruction. The Nile's floods, always the foundation of Egyptian prosperity, continued their unpredictable patterns, some years abundant, others meager, all requiring careful management of grain reserves and distribution systems. But Cleopatra possessed advantages her father had lacked. She could speak directly to her subjects in their own language, could participate in religious ceremonies with genuine understanding rather than rote repetition, could present herself as pharaoh in the traditional sense, rather than merely as foreign monarch who happened to rule Egypt. This cultural fluency, combined with her obvious intelligence and the confidence that came from surviving mortal threats, created a foundation of legitimacy that mere bloodline could not provide. More importantly, she understood what her father had learned too late, that Egypt's independence was now theoretical rather than practical, that preservation required accepting Roman supremacy while maintaining Egyptian dignity. She ruled not by pretending Egypt was still a great power, but by making it indispensable to Rome's greater power. The grain that flowed from Egypt's fields fed Rome's populace. The wealth that accumulated in Alexandria's treasury financed Rome's wars. The stability she maintained ensured that Rome need not waste legions administering what loyal allies could manage themselves. It was a strategy of survival through utility, dignity through necessity. In 46 BC, an invitation arrived from Rome. Caesar, having defeated the last remnants of Pompey's supporters in Africa and Spain, planned a series of triumphs to celebrate his victories. He invited Cleopatra to visit the capital, to witness his glory, to enjoy his hospitality. The invitation was both honor and summons, both courtesy and command. She accepted, understanding that refusal was not truly an option, that maintaining Caesar's favor required her presence in Rome, and that perhaps Egypt's interests might be advanced by demonstrating to the Roman populace that their general's Egyptian ally was not some barbaric Oriental queen, but a cultured, intelligent monarch worthy of respect. She sailed to Rome with her entourage, servants, advisors, guards, and young Caesarion, perhaps 2 years old, a child who represented both her connection to Caesar and, potentially, a threat to Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian Caesar, installed her in his villa across the Tiber, in the gardens where the wealthy kept their pleasure estates, close enough to Rome to be convenient, but technically outside the city's sacred boundary. It was a diplomatic positioning, neither fully foreign nor quite Roman, neither completely separated nor dangerously integrated. The Rome she encountered was a city transforming before its own eyes. The Republic still functioned in form. Elections were held. Magistrates served their terms. The Senate debated in its ancient chamber. But beneath these familiar rituals, power had shifted irrevocably to one man. Caesar had returned victorious from a decade of conquests and civil wars. He had defeated every rival, conquered Gaul, subdued Egypt, and emerged as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The question everyone asked quietly was not whether he would be king. That title was still poisonous in Republican Rome. But what new title might be invented to describe what he had already become? Cleopatra watched this transformation from her villa, meeting with senators who came to pay courtesy calls, discussing philosophy with Roman intellectuals, observing how power actually worked in the Republic that claimed to govern through law. The Senate still met, but increasingly, its debates ratified decisions Caesar had already made. The assemblies still voted, but Caesar's veterans dominated them. The courts still functioned, but Caesar's clemency mattered more than their verdicts. It was a masterclass in how institutions could be preserved while their substance evaporated, how forms could be maintained while meanings changed. Her presence in Rome generated both fascination and resentment. To some Romans, she represented the exotic sophistication of the East, a queen who could discuss Aristotle in Greek and Egyptian theology in her subjects' own tongue, who brought with her the glamour of ancient dynasties and the wealth of the Nile. To others, she embodied everything they feared about Caesar's ambitions: foreign influence, monarchical pretensions, the corruption of Roman virtue by Oriental luxury. The conservatives who still believed in the Republic's restoration saw in her the proof that Caesar had abandoned Roman values for Eastern despotism. The scandal deepened when Caesar placed a golden statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the shrine he had built to honor the goddess from whom his family claimed descent. To place a living person's image and a foreign queen's image in a Roman temple was to blur the line between mortal and divine, to suggest that royalty deserved worship, to import into Rome the very concept of divine kingship that Romans had rejected when they expelled their last king 5 centuries before. The gesture might have been meant as honor, but it became ammunition for those who whispered that Caesar sought to make himself king in all but name. Yet Cleopatra's time in Rome was not merely social theatre. She brought with her scholars and specialists who contributed to Caesar's ambitious projects. Egyptian astronomers assisted in reforming the Roman calendar, helping design what would become the Julian calendar, a solar calendar far more accurate than Rome's old lunar system, a piece of Egyptian knowledge transplanted to Roman soil. The reform was practical rather than ceremonial, but it demonstrated how Egypt's ancient learning could serve Rome's needs, how Cleopatra's presence brought advantages beyond the symbolic. She remained in Rome through 46 and into 44 BC, a foreign queen living in Roman territory, allied to but not married to the Republic's master, mother of his only biological son, yet unable to claim that paternity officially. The position was inherently unstable. Her security depended entirely on Caesar's continued favor, her son's future on Caesar's willingness to acknowledge him, her kingdom's autonomy on Caesar's policy of allowing capable client rulers to govern themselves. Everything rested on one man's life continuing, one man's ambitions succeeding, one man's power remaining unchallenged. But in Rome, during those years of Caesar's supremacy, power bred resentment in the shadows. The senators who smiled and voted as Caesar wished nursed private grievances. The Republicans who had accepted defeat outwardly plotted restoration secretly. The men who had benefited from Caesar's clemency after fighting against him felt their debt as burden rather than blessing. And among all these currents of discontent ran a single conviction: that Caesar had gone too far, claimed too much, and threatened to transform the Republic into something fundamentally different from what it had been. The conspiracy formed slowly, carefully, drawing together men of different motives united by shared fear. Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar trusted and perhaps loved like a son, saw himself as defender of ancestral liberty. Gaius Cassius Longinus, sharp and bitter, resented Caesar's dominance and remembered the Republic's old forms. Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's most successful generals, convinced himself that preserving the Republic required destroying the man who had made him wealthy. They gathered perhaps 60 senators to their cause, each swearing to strike when opportunity allowed, each believing that Caesar's death would restore the Republic they remembered. The date they chose was March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March in the Roman calendar, a day that would become synonymous with betrayal. The location was the Curia of Pompey, the theatre complex built by Caesar's defeated rival, a space that combined bitter irony with practical convenience. The Senate was meeting there while Caesar's new forum was under construction, and the conspirators had planned their action with careful attention to symbolism and opportunity. On that morning, omens appeared, or were later said to have appeared, as omens always do when disaster strikes. Caesar's wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his murder, begged him to stay home, urged him to at least delay the Senate meeting. The soothsayer who had warned him to beware the Ides of March watched as he passed, and Caesar joked that the day had come and he was still safe. A message warning him of the plot was thrust into his hand as he entered the theatre, but he did not read it, either from confidence or because the crowd of petitioners made private reading impossible. The mechanisms of fate or chance or simple carelessness moved him toward his appointed hour. When the senators gathered and Caesar took his seat, a conspirator approached with a petition. Others crowded close, ostensibly supporting their colleague's request. Then Casca struck the first blow, his dagger catching Caesar in the shoulder. The others surged forward, and for a few chaotic moments, the world's most powerful man fought against a crowd of assassins in the midst of the Roman Senate. The ancient sources claim he defended himself at first, striking back with his stylus, the writing instrument that was his only weapon. But when he saw Brutus among his killers, et tu, Brute, and you, Brute, Brutus, the fight left him. He pulled his toga over his head, covering his face, and fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling on marble dedicated to the rival he had defeated. The conspirators fled the Senate chamber, expecting acclamation. They had killed a tyrant, they believed, restored the Republic, freed Rome from the threat of monarchy. They ran into the streets shouting, "Liberty," expecting crowds to cheer their deed. Instead, they found a stunned city, confused citizens, and rapidly emptying forums. The people who should have celebrated their liberation stood silent, uncertain, afraid. The veterans who had followed Caesar through Gaul and civil wars began gathering in armed groups, not to celebrate the dictator's death, but to avenge it. By nightfall, the liberators were barricading themselves in their homes, and Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, was already maneuvering to control the aftermath. In her villa across the Tiber, Cleopatra heard the news and understood immediately that everything had changed. The man who guaranteed her throne was dead. The ally who protected Egypt's independence had been murdered by his own senators. The father of her son, though never officially acknowledged, would never see the boy grow to manhood. She was suddenly alone in a foreign capital whose politics had just become lethally unpredictable. ruling a kingdom whose security had depended entirely on one man's favor. The prudent course was obvious. Leave Rome immediately. Return to Egypt before the chaos of succession made travel impossible or dangerous. Mark Antony and the conspirators were already maneuvering for position. Caesar's veterans were demanding vengeance. And the will that Caesar had left was about to be read publicly. A will that might address the question of his legacy, and his heir, Cleopatra, could contribute nothing to these Roman struggles, and remaining risked being swept up in violence that cared nothing for Egyptian interests. She departed quietly, taking her household and young Caesarion, sailing from Ostia before the full implications of Caesar's death could unfold. The journey back to Alexandria was both escape and return, flight from Rome's instability and homecoming to a kingdom that now faced an uncertain future without its Roman protector. The Mediterranean crossing gave her time to calculate, to plan, to consider how Egypt might survive in a world where Caesar's stabilizing influence had been suddenly removed. When she reached Alexandria in the spring of 44 BC, she found her kingdom stable but vulnerable. The administration she had built functioned smoothly. The harvests had been adequate. The treasury was managed carefully. But all of this now existed without the shield that Caesar's favor had provided. Rome's civil wars were about to resume, this time between Caesar's assassins and those who claimed to avenge him. Egypt would need to navigate these conflicts carefully, aligning with whoever emerged victorious while avoiding commitments that might prove fatal if the other side won. Within months of her return, Cleopatra's young brother-husband, Ptolemy XIV, died suddenly. The official explanation was natural causes, but in the Ptolemaic court, where poison was as common as ceremony, few believed in coincidence. Whether Cleopatra ordered his death or merely allowed it to happen, the result served her purposes. Caesarion, now about 3 years old, became her co-ruler as Ptolemy XV. For the first time, the fiction of shared rule matched reality. She was queen and her son was king, and no adult male relative could challenge her authority or serve as tool for ambitious courtiers. She crowned the child pharaoh with all the ceremony that tradition demanded, establishing him as legitimate heir to the Ptolemaic throne, and, in Egyptian eyes, as rightful ruler blessed by the gods. That Caesar had been his father was proclaimed in the name Caesarion, but never officially acknowledged by Rome. Yet, the boy represented a possibility, however distant, that if Caesar's legacy was somehow restored, if his adopted son Octavian failed to consolidate power, if Rome's civil wars created an opening, then perhaps Caesarion might claim his paternal inheritance. It was a long hope, but Cleopatra had learned to play long games. The news from Rome grew increasingly complex and violent. Mark Antony had delivered Caesar's funeral oration, displaying the bloody toga and reading the will that left gardens to the Roman people and money to every citizen, gifts that turned grief into fury against the assassins. The conspirators fled, some to Greece, others to Africa, gathering armies and preparing for civil war. And from the margins emerged a figure no one had anticipated: Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew, an adopted son in his will, who began calling himself Caesar and demanding his inheritance. Cleopatra watched these developments from Alexandria, receiving reports from her agents in Rome, trying to determine which faction would prevail and how Egypt might navigate the chaos she had learned from Caesar, that the future belonged to those who refused to accept limitations, who bent circumstances through sheer force of will. She had learned from her own experience that survival required intelligence, adaptability, and the willingness to align with power wherever it appeared. She had learned that crowns were held not through ancient right, but through present capacity. In the palace where she had been born, and from which she had been exiled, and to which she had returned in triumph, Cleopatra ruled Egypt with the understanding that all her achievements remained contingent. She was queen, but her kingdom existed in the shadow of Roman civil war. She was mother to a son who might one day claim Caesar's name. But that claim meant nothing if Rome rejected it. She had survived her first test, but the storms gathering across the Mediterranean would prove fiercer than anything she had yet faced. The man who had given her throne and taken her as lover was dead, murdered by the very system he had tried to transform. The republic he had dominated was tearing itself apart again. And somewhere in that chaos, forces were gathering that would eventually turn their attention to Egypt, demanding its allegiance, seeking its wealth, requiring decisions that would determine whether the last Ptolemaic queen would preserve her kingdom or watch it finally surrender to Rome's embrace. For now, she ruled. The Nile flooded on schedule. The harvests came. The administration functioned. But the lighthouse burning in Alexandria's harbour illuminated a kingdom whose independence had become increasingly theoretical, whose future would be decided not in its own councils, but on battlefields where Roman generals competed for supremacy. Cleopatra had learned to survive in this world, but survival was not yet victory, and the next chapter of her story was already being written in camps where Caesar's successors gathered their armies. The queen who had come of age in exile and war, who had won her throne through courage and intelligence, who had allied with Rome's greatest general and borne his son, now faced her kingdom's future with the sober awareness that everything could change again, that nothing was secure, and that the only constant in her world was uncertainty itself. The dying dynasty had survived one more crisis, but its survival remained, as always, temporary, a matter of time measured not in centuries, but in the years until Rome's civil wars reached their final resolution. In the palace gardens, where she had played as a child and studied as a princess and now ruled as queen, Cleopatra stood watching the sunset paint the Mediterranean sky with fire and gold, and prepared for storms she could not yet see but knew were coming. The Alexandria to which Cleopatra returned in the spring of 44, BRAC, was both familiar and subtly changed, like a face seen after years of absence that bears new lines, though the features remain the same. The palace stood as it always had, its marble columns catching the morning light, its gardens perfumed with jasmine and lotus. The harbour bustled with the commerce of 3 continents, grain ships from the delta bound for distant ports, merchant vessels carrying spices and silk and glass, fishing boats whose catches fed the city's restless population. On the surface, Egypt continued as Egypt always had, its rhythms governed by the Nile's annual flood and the sun's daily passage. But beneath this continuity lay a new vulnerability, an awareness that the kingdom's survival now depended on forces beyond its borders and beyond its control. She returned not as a suppliant fleeing danger, but as queen returning to her realm. Yet the distinction felt increasingly fragile. Caesar's death had severed the connection that guaranteed Egypt's security within Rome's expanding sphere. The protection she had enjoyed, the knowledge that the Mediterranean's most powerful general considered Egypt valuable enough to defend, had vanished in the few minutes it took for senatorial daggers to end a life. Now she ruled a kingdom that was wealthy but militarily weak, strategically vital but diplomatically isolated, ancient in its claims but uncertain in its future. The first task was consolidation. Cleopatra moved through the palace corridors with the efficiency of someone who understood that power was maintained through constant attention to detail. She met with the administrators who had managed Egypt in her absence, reviewed the treasury's accounts, inspected the grain reserves that were both Egypt's wealth and its leverage over Rome. She held audiences with the priests of Memphis and Thebes, renewing the bonds between throne and temple that legitimized her rule in Egyptian rather than Greek terms. She appeared in public ceremonies, demonstrating that despite Rome's chaos, Egypt's governance continued uninterrupted. The death of her brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, whether from natural causes or political necessity, removed the last adult male who might serve as rallying point for those who resented her authority. His passing was mourned with appropriate ceremony, but the transition to Caesarion as co-ruler was accomplished with remarkable smoothness. The boy was perhaps 3 years old when he was crowned Ptolemy XV, too young to rule, but perfect for Cleopatra's purposes. A co-regent who legitimized her power through his presence while offering no threat through his actions. The court understood Egypt had one ruler, and she wore the double crown without apology or disguise. The months following her return were dedicated to the unglamorous work of governance, managing the complex irrigation systems that made Egyptian agriculture possible, adjudicating disputes between Greek settlers and Egyptian farmers, maintaining the fleet that protected trade routes, ensuring that tax collection was efficient without being oppressive. These were not the dramatic gestures that chroniclers recorded for posterity, but they were the activities that kept kingdoms functioning when the personalities that dominated them were removed. Cleopatra proved herself not merely a survivor of palace intrigue, but a capable administrator, attentive to the mechanisms that translated royal authority into actual governance. The Nile's behavior remained, as always, the ultimate determinant of Egypt's prosperity. The god Hapi, who brought the inundation, seemed to smile on the early years of Cleopatra's sole rule. The floods came at their appointed time, neither catastrophically high nor dangerously low, spreading the rich black silt across fields that had known agriculture for 4 millennia. The harvest that followed filled the granaries, ensuring that Egypt could feed its own people and supply the grain that Rome's populace demanded. Good harvests meant stable prices, content farmers, and a treasury that could meet its obligations without crushing taxation. In the mathematics of ancient kingdoms, the Nile's generosity translated directly into political stability. But even as Egypt's internal affairs stabilized, the Mediterranean world convulsed with the aftershocks of Caesar's assassination. News arrived in Alexandria through the normal channels of commerce and diplomacy, each dispatch painting a picture of Rome's descent into renewed civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul and lieutenant, had positioned himself as avenger of his murdered commander. The conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and their allies, had fled east, gathering armies in Greece and Syria, and Octavian, the 18-year-old whom Caesar had adopted as son and heir, had entered Rome's political arena with an audacity that belied his youth, claiming Caesar's name and demanding his inheritance. From Alexandria, Cleopatra watched these developments with the calculating attention of someone whose kingdom's fate depended on predicting Rome's future. She had learned from Caesar that Roman politics operated through temporary alliances that dissolved when convenient, that personal loyalty mattered less than perceived advantage, that the Republic's constitutional forms had become masks for raw competition between ambitious men. The question was not which side deserved support, but which side would win, and how Egypt might position itself to be valuable to the victors without being vulnerable to the defeated. The civil war that erupted in 43 BC was Rome's fourth in 2 decades, a pattern of violence that suggested the Republic's institutions could no longer contain the ambitions of those who competed within them. Octavian, despite his youth, proved surprisingly adept at manipulating the Senate and marshalling support. He secured a command against Antony, marched on Rome when the Senate hesitated to grant him what he wanted, and forced his own election as consul at an age that made a mockery of constitutional requirements. The Republic's forms persisted, but they had become pure theatre, performances staged to give legitimacy to outcomes determined by military force. Then came a development that should have been impossible, but proved inevitable. Octavian and Antony, who had been rivals and enemies, formed an alliance. They met on an island in a river near Bononia, along with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the governor of Spain and Africa. There, in November 43 BC, they created what history would call the Second Triumvirate, a formal division of power among three men who controlled armies and provinces. Unlike the informal pact between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this triumvirate was given legal sanction, approved by legislation that granted the three men consular authority for 5 years to restore the Republic. The prescriptions that followed demonstrated how thoroughly that Republic had died. The triumvirs published lists of political enemies to be killed, their properties confiscated to fund the armies that would fight Caesar's assassins. The victims included senators, equestrians, and anyone wealthy enough to make their murder profitable. Among them fell Cicero, the great orator who had defended the Republic with words, now silenced by swords. His head and hands were cut off and displayed on the rostra where he had once spoken, a grotesque symbol of how thoroughly violence had replaced rhetoric as Rome's political language. News of these proscriptions reached Alexandria with traders who had fled Rome's terror. Cleopatra heard the accounts with the grim recognition that the world had become even more unstable than she had calculated. The triumvirate commanded vast resources and showed no restraint in using them. They were marching east to confront Brutus and Cassius, who had assembled their own armies in Greece and Asia Minor. The coming battle would determine Rome's future, and Egypt would need to choose sides carefully or risk being swept away by whoever emerged victorious. The decision was complicated by geography and obligation. Brutus and Cassius, controlling the eastern Mediterranean, demanded that Egypt supply their forces with grain and ships. They argued that they fought to restore the Republic, to avenge the murder of a dictator, a curious reversal that cast the assassins as victims and themselves as justice's instruments. But Cleopatra remembered that these same men had murdered Caesar, the father of her son, the protector of her throne. Personal sentiment and political calculation aligned. Supporting Caesar's killers would be both dangerous and wrong. Yet outright refusal was equally perilous. Her kingdom sat exposed to forces that could destroy it, possessing wealth that made it valuable to both sides. She needed to navigate between compliance and defiance, to appear cooperative without committing resources that might later be held against her. The strategy she adopted was delay, sending promises that were not quite commitments, citing difficulties that were not quite refusals, playing for time while the triumvirs marched east to settle the question militarily. The decisive confrontation came in October 42 BC near the town of Philippi in Macedonia. There, on plains that had seen Philip of Macedon train the armies, his son Alexander would lead to India. Rome's future was determined. Brutus and Cassius commanded experienced legions, held strong positions, and fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that defeat meant death. But Antony's military genius and Octavian's growing competence, though illness kept him from the battle's thick fighting, proved superior. The first engagement was indecisive, but the second shattered the Republican forces completely. Cassius, receiving false reports that all was lost, killed himself. Brutus held out for weeks, then followed his colleague into death after his own forces were overwhelmed. Their heads were sent to Rome, where they would be displayed as trophies and warnings. The men who had killed Caesar in the name of preserving the Republic had been destroyed by Caesar's heirs in the name of avenging him. The Republic they died defending was already dead. They simply had not accepted the diagnosis. With the battlefield decided, the triumvirs divided the Roman world between them. Octavian would govern the western provinces, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and manage the difficult task of settling veterans on Italian lands, a process guaranteed to create resentment among those whose property was confiscated. Lepidus received Africa, a wealthy but peripheral position that reflected his status as junior partner. And Antony claimed the East, the rich provinces of Asia Minor, Syria, and everything beyond, including oversight of client kingdoms like Egypt. For Cleopatra, this division had immediate and profound implications. Her kingdom's fate now rested in the hands of Mark Antony, the soldier who had been Caesar's loyal lieutenant, who had delivered the funeral oration that turned Rome against the assassins, who now commanded the legions that controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Everything she had built, her restoration to power, her son's position, Egypt's relative autonomy, would now be evaluated by a man she had met only briefly during Caesar's time in Alexandria, a general whose character and intentions she would need to understand quickly and completely. In 41 BC, Antony summoned her to meet him at Tarsus in Cilicia. The message was phrased as invitation, but Cleopatra recognized command when she heard it. He wanted to assess Egypt's loyalty, to determine whether she had supported Brutus and Cassius, to ensure that the kingdom's resources would flow to him rather than to potential rivals. The summons also carried opportunity. If she could convince Antony that Egypt was valuable as ally rather than useful as conquest, that she was competent ruler rather than merely exotic queen, then perhaps she could preserve the autonomy that Caesar's death had endangered. She prepared for this meeting with the same intelligence she had brought to every challenge: careful calculation, theatrical presentation, and absolute clarity about objectives. The queen who sailed to meet Mark Antony was not desperate suppliant, but independent monarch. Not beggar seeking favor, but partner offering advantages. The ships that carried her north along the coast represented Egypt's last chance to navigate Rome's civil wars successfully, to preserve a kingdom that had survived 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule and might yet survive the transition to whatever Rome was becoming. In her palace, before departure, Cleopatra spent time with young Caesarion, now perhaps 4 years old, speaking to him in both Greek and Egyptian, teaching him that kings must learn languages and strategies, that survival required understanding the world beyond palace walls. The boy who might someday claim his father's name played in gardens where his mother had learned similar lessons, unconscious of the forces that shaped his fate. His future depended entirely on his mother's ability to negotiate with a Roman general in a distant city, to charm and convince and demonstrate that Egypt could be ally rather than prey. The Nile, rising on its eternal schedule, brought black silt to fields that had known cultivation since before Troy fell. The harvests came, the granaries filled, the kingdom's rhythms continued as they had for millennia. But Cleopatra understood what perhaps no previous Ptolemaic ruler had fully grasped: that the Nile's gift was no longer sufficient, that agricultural wealth could not substitute for military power, that Egypt's independence existed only in the space between Roman civil wars and would evaporate when those wars finally ended. The queen who ruled in Caesar's shadow now prepared to meet his successor, knowing that this encounter would determine whether Egypt remained kingdom or became province, whether she remained queen or became memory. The lighthouse burned at Alexandria's harbour as her fleet prepared to sail north, its fire visible across the dark Mediterranean, a beacon that had guided ships for more than a century. Soon that beacon would guide her home, either as queen who had secured her kingdom's future, or as ruler who had failed the final test. The difference between those outcomes would be determined by intelligence, presentation, and the unpredictable judgment of a Roman general who held Egypt's fate in his battle-hardened hands. The ships that carried her toward Tarsus also carried Egypt's hopes, Caesarion's future, and the last remnants of Ptolemaic independence. The wind filled their sails, and the queen, who had survived exile, civil war, and assassination's aftermath, prepared for an encounter that would determine whether her dynasty's 300-year story would continue, or whether she would become its final, failing chapter. The future approached across calm Mediterranean waters, and Cleopatra sailed to meet it, with the courage of someone who had learned that survival required more than birthright. It required the willingness to risk everything in the defense of what could not be surrendered. The last queen of Egypt sailed north toward her destiny, and the dying dynasty held its breath, waiting to learn whether genius and determination could substitute for the power it had lost, whether intelligence could preserve what armies could no longer defend. The answer waited in a city she had never seen, in the judgment of a man she barely knew, in a meeting that would reshape her life, and the lives of all who depended on her ability to navigate the treacherous waters where kingdoms and empires met, where survival and extinction were separated by nothing more than words spoken well or poorly in a Roman general's tent. The Cydnus River flowed quietly through the coastal plains of Cilicia, its waters carrying the ordinary traffic of commerce and communication toward the sea. But on a late summer afternoon in 41 BC, it carried something extraordinary. A royal barge that seemed to have sailed from the pages of poetry rather than the harbours of politics. Purple sails billowed above gilded woodwork, their fabric dyed with the rare Tyrian colour that cost more than common ships in Tyre. The prow was carved and painted to shimmer in the sun, and on the deck, beneath a canopy woven with gold thread, reclined a figure dressed as Aphrodite herself, attended by servants costumed as sea nymphs and cupids. Mark Antony, waiting in Tarsus to receive Egypt's queen, had expected a diplomatic visit, a negotiation between Roman authority and client monarch, a routine assertion of dominance followed by reassurances of loyalty. What arrived was theatre, spectacle, and a demonstration that Cleopatra understood power's theatrical dimension, as well as its practical mechanics. The crowds that gathered along the riverbank spoke in wonder, comparing what they saw to paintings and poems, suggesting that the goddess herself had come to visit the god Dionysus, for Antony had long cultivated associations with that deity, presenting himself as the life-giving, wine-blessed force of abundance. The message of Cleopatra's arrival was clear before a single word was spoken. This was not supplication, but partnership, not submission, but alliance between equals who each possessed what the other needed. Antony sent invitations for her to dine with him in the city. She replied, politely but firmly, that he should dine with her aboard the barge instead. The reversal was subtle but significant. She would not present herself as petitioner, attending the pleasure of a superior, but as queen, receiving a distinguished visitor, Antony, amused by her audacity or impressed by her confidence, accepted. The dinner that followed became legendary for its opulence. Courses that represented the wealth of Egypt's fields and the sophistication of Alexandria's kitchens. Wine from cellars where vintages were measured in decades, and conversation in Latin that demonstrated she needed no interpreter to match wits with Rome's masters. What transpired between them over those days in Tarsus was part negotiation, part seduction, part mutual evaluation. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection for Egypt, needed to demonstrate that supporting her kingdom served Roman interests better than conquering it. Would Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund the campaigns he planned against Parthia, needed reliable allies in the east, and perhaps needed something less definable, a connection to the culture and sophistication that Rome's civil wars had not quite destroyed. She was 28, experienced in power's exercise, educated beyond most senators, and determined to preserve her kingdom through any means necessary. He was 42, a brilliant general whose loyalty to Caesar had defined his career, now master of Rome's eastern territories, an architect of campaigns that might eclipse even Alexander's conquests. The attraction between them, whether genuine passion or carefully crafted performance, served both their purposes. For Cleopatra, an alliance cemented by personal connection was stronger than one based solely on calculated advantage. For Antony, the queen who had captivated Caesar represented both political opportunity and perhaps something he had not found among Roman women, whose alliances were arranged for family advancement rather than personal connection. The accounts written later by their enemies emphasized seduction and enchantment, as though Cleopatra's power lay in feminine wiles rather than intelligence. But those closer to events understood that what developed between them was more complex than simple romance. It was a partnership between two skilled political operators who recognized in each other both usefulness and understanding. They negotiated the practical matters efficiently. Egypt would support Antony's campaigns, providing gold, grain, and ships. In return, Antony would confirm Cleopatra's authority, defend Egypt's borders, and eliminate threats to her rule. Among those threats was her sister, Arsinoe, who had opposed her during the Alexandrian War and had been living in exile at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Despite the sanctuary that temple service should have provided, Antony ordered her execution, a gesture that demonstrated his commitment to Cleopatra's security and his willingness to violate traditional protections when expedient. The murder of a princess in a sacred precinct shocked traditionalists, but it sent a clear message. Those who threatened Cleopatra's rule now threatened Antony's interests. As autumn approached and administrative matters were settled, Antony accepted Cleopatra's invitation to winter in Alexandria. The decision was both personal and practical. He needed to solidify his eastern alliances, assess Egypt's resources firsthand, and prepare for the Parthian campaign that would, he hoped, make his reputation equal to Caesar's or even greater. For Cleopatra, having Rome's eastern commander winter in her capital meant security against rivals and the opportunity to demonstrate Egypt's continuing vitality and value. The Alexandria to which they returned was a city that still deserved its reputation as jewel of the Mediterranean. The library, though diminished by the fires of civil war, still drew scholars from across the known world. The museum continued its work of preserving and expanding human knowledge. The harbour bustled with commerce from 3 continents. Greek theatres presented plays by Euripides and Menander. Egyptian temples maintained rituals older than Homer. The city was a fusion of cultures that worked not despite its contradictions, but because of them. A place where Greek philosophy could debate Egyptian theology, where Phoenician merchants could negotiate with Arabian traders, where the accumulated wisdom of centuries coexisted with the commercial urgency of the present. For Antony, accustomed to military camps and the harsh simplicities of Roman politics, Alexandria offered pleasures both sensual and intellectual. He and Cleopatra formed a society they called the Inimitable Livers, a circle dedicated to pleasure, learning, and the aristocratic ideal that life should be lived with style, regardless of consequence. They dined extravagantly, staged elaborate entertainments, and cultivated an atmosphere of sophisticated indulgence. But beneath the parties and the pageantry, serious work continued. Antony prepared his Parthian campaign, reviewing maps and intelligence, corresponding with commanders across the east. Cleopatra managed Egypt's affairs, ensuring that the grain shipments to Rome continued uninterrupted, that the treasury could support both domestic needs and Antony's military requirements. In 40 BC, obligations called Antony back to Italy. His wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius had attempted a revolt against Octavian, a clumsy effort to assert Antony's interests in his absence that ended in defeat and humiliation. Fulvia died shortly after, removing a complication, but also eliminating a connection to Roman politics that Antony had maintained through marriage. The triumvirate that had seemed stable after Philippi now showed fractures, and Antony needed to return west to renegotiate the balance of power with Octavian. The meeting between the two remaining triumvirs, Lepidus had been marginalized, his authority reduced to nominal control of Africa, took place at Brundisium in the autumn of 40 BC. War seemed possible. Both men had assembled forces, but negotiation prevailed, producing a new agreement. The Treaty of Brundisium confirmed the division of the Roman world between them, with Antony holding the east and Octavian the west. The boundary set at Scodra in Illyricum. To seal this arrangement, Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia, a union that bound the two men in family alliance, and suggested that cooperation might be possible despite underlying rivalries. For Cleopatra, waiting in Alexandria, this marriage represented both setback and relief. The personal relationship she had developed with Antony was complicated by his Roman marriage, yet the political alliance she needed remained intact. Roman law permitted multiple partnerships in ways that differed from formal marriage. Antony could maintain both his strategic marriage to Octavia and his liaison with Cleopatra without technically violating either. The situation was awkward but manageable, typical of the compromises that characterized Antony's attempts to balance Eastern and Western responsibilities. The years 40 and 39 BC passed with Antony in the West, managing his reconciliation with Octavian and attending to Italian affairs. During this period, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy named Alexander Helios, sun, and a girl named Cleopatra Selene, moon. Their names declared their mixed heritage. Alexander invoked both the Macedonian conqueror and Antony's own claimed descent from Heracles. The celestial imagery reflected Egyptian royal symbolism. Antony did not witness their birth, did not acknowledge them immediately, and perhaps did not even know of their existence for months or years. But Cleopatra raised them as royal children, heirs to the Ptolemaic throne, and potentially claimants to whatever legacy their father might leave. The Treaty of Brundisium held precariously. Antony and Octavian met again at Tarentum in 37 BC, extending the triumvirate for another 5 years and reaffirming their division of power. But beneath the diplomatic language and family connections, the fundamental rivalry remained unresolved. Each man commanded legions that answered to him personally rather than to the Roman state. Each controlled territories that provided independent resources. Each harbored ambitions that could not be satisfied while the other existed. The treaty was less peace than postponement, a mutual agreement to delay confrontation until one side felt confident of victory. After Tarentum, Antony returned east to prepare finally for the Parthian campaign he had delayed too long. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Syria, and when she arrived, he acknowledged their children and the relationship they represented. More significantly, He granted her territories that had once belonged to the Ptolemaic kingdom, but had been lost over generations of decline. Portions of Phoenicia, Cilicia, Crete, and Cyrenaica. These grants restored some of Egypt's ancient empire, though they remained technically under Roman authority and depended on Antony's continued power. Nevertheless, they represented a significant expansion of Cleopatra's domain and suggested that Antony envisioned a future where Egypt would be major partner rather than mere client. The reasons for these grants were both personal and practical. Personally, Antony and Cleopatra had developed a partnership that transcended simple political calculation. Whether it constituted love or mutual dependence or sophisticated role-playing, it bound them together in ways that affected both their decisions. Practically, Antony needed Egypt's resources for his campaigns more than he needed to preserve the precise boundaries that Roman tradition prescribed. Better to have a wealthy, capable ally who controlled a larger territory than a restricted client always lobbying for concessions. In 36 BC, Antony launched his long-planned invasion of Parthia, the Eastern Empire that had humiliated Crassus at Carrhae and remained Rome's only serious rival. The campaign began with confidence. Antony commanded experienced legions, had secured his supply lines through allied kingdoms, and believed that careful planning would avoid the mistakes that had destroyed previous Roman expeditions. But Parthian warfare differed fundamentally from the set-piece battles at which Roman legions excelled. The Parthians relied on mounted archers whose mobility frustrated the heavy infantry's discipline, on scorched earth tactics that denied invaders supplies, on a landscape that seemed designed to swallow armies. The campaign became disaster. Antony's forces advanced deep into Parthian territory, but found no decisive battle, no capital to besiege, no clear objective that would translate military presence into victory. His siege train was destroyed, his supply lines harassed, his troops subjected to constant skirmishing that eroded morale without producing the climactic engagement where Roman discipline could prevail. When winter approached, he was forced to retreat, not in rout, but in the grinding ordeal of withdrawing through hostile territory, where every step cost lives. The legionaries who staggered back to Roman territory had been reduced by disease, desertion, and daily attrition. Perhaps a third of the invasion force failed to return. For a general whose reputation rested on military competence, the Parthian disaster was both humiliation and warning. Antony had gambled on a victory that would establish him as Caesar's military equal, perhaps superior. Instead, he had demonstrated that even brilliant commanders could fail against enemies who refused to fight on Roman terms. The failure weakened his position vis-à-vis Octavian, who could claim that his own cautious management of the West had produced stability, while Antony's adventurism had produced corpses. Cleopatra met him as he retreated into Syria, bringing supplies, gold, and the political support he needed to maintain his authority despite military failure. Her assistance went beyond material aid. She helped him manage the narrative of defeat, presenting it as temporary setback rather than decisive loss, maintaining the fiction that renewed campaigns might yet achieve what the first had failed to accomplish. In return, Antony acknowledged publicly what had been obvious privately, that Cleopatra was not merely ally but partner, not simply Queen of Egypt but co-architect of his Eastern strategy. In late 36 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to their third child, a son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Unlike the twins, whose birth Antony had not witnessed, he was present for this child's arrival, a gesture that suggested the relationship had deepened from political convenience into something more personally significant. The boy was named in the Ptolemaic tradition, linking him to the dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. but his existence also represented the growing entanglement between Rome's eastern commander and Egypt's queen. The years that followed were marked by a curious stability. Antony remained in the east, governing his provinces, planning renewed campaigns against Parthia, and living increasingly as Eastern monarch rather than Roman magistrate. His marriage to Octavia persisted on paper, but she remained in Rome while he remained with Cleopatra in Alexandria or Antioch. The twins and young Ptolemy, Philadelphus, grew in the palace where their mother ruled, learning Greek and Egyptian, being groomed for roles that would depend entirely on whether their parents could preserve the power they had built together. Egypt prospered under this arrangement. The territories Antony had granted provided new sources of revenue and strategic depth. Trade flourished under the protection of Roman military power, combined with Egyptian commercial networks. The harvests continued to fill granaries that fed both Egypt and Rome's eastern legions. Cleopatra ruled with the confidence of someone whose position was more secure than it had been since Caesar's death, yet also with the awareness that everything depended on Antony maintaining his half of the Roman world against Octavian's ambitions. The partnership they had forged at Tarsus and deepened through shared challenges represented something unusual in the relations between Rome and client kingdoms. A genuine collaboration between Roman commander and Eastern monarch, based on mutual respect as well as mutual need. Whether it constituted love in the sense poets describe or something more complex, a bond formed by shared interests, compatible temperaments, and the recognition that each needed what the other provided mattered less than its effectiveness. Together, they commanded resources that rivaled Octavian's. Together, they represented a vision of Rome's future that differed from the traditional model, one where Eastern wealth and culture were embraced rather than merely exploited, where client monarchs could be partners rather than subordinates, where the Mediterranean world might be governed through cooperation between Roman military power and regional kingdoms. But in Rome, this vision appeared not as enlightened administration, but as abandonment of Roman virtue. Octavian, whose own power rested on equally unconstitutional foundations, nevertheless positioned himself as defender of traditional values against Eastern corruption. His propaganda portrayed Antony not as capable administrator of Rome's eastern territories, but as Roman who had gone native, abandoned his lawful wife for an Oriental queen, and betrayed Roman interests for personal pleasure. The narrative was powerful because it contained elements of truth, twisted to serve political purpose. Antony had indeed formed closer connections to the east than previous Roman commanders, had indeed maintained a relationship with Cleopatra that went beyond diplomatic necessity. But these facts were presented in the most sinister possible light, stripped of context and transformed into evidence of fundamental betrayal. As 37 BC ended and 36 began, the Mediterranean world existed in a state of armed peace. Two men who called each other brother-in-law and colleague prepared for the confrontation that both knew was inevitable. Each controlled roughly half the Roman world. Each commanded legions that had proven themselves in battle. Each believed himself the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. Between them stood agreements that neither quite trusted, and marriages that neither could dissolve without signaling hostile intent. The peace would hold only as long as both sides needed it to, and the forces gathering on either side of the boundary at Scodra suggested that need was diminishing with each passing season. In Alexandria, Cleopatra ruled Egypt and raised her children, with the understanding that their future depended entirely on the coming conflict between Roman rivals. She had navigated her kingdom through 2 decades of Rome's civil wars, had survived the deaths of protectors and the rise of enemies, had preserved Egyptian independence through intelligence and adaptability when military power no longer sufficed. But the final test was approaching. A confrontation between Antony and Octavian that would determine not only which man controlled Rome, but whether Egypt could continue as kingdom or would finally become province, whether she remained queen or became memory, whether her children would inherit kingdoms or die in the purges that followed defeat. The lighthouse at Alexandria's harbour still burned its nightly warning and welcome, visible across the dark waters, where merchant ships carried grain to feed Rome's populace, and where, increasingly, warships gathered to prepare for the storm that was coming. The queen who had first travelled to Tarsus to secure her kingdom's survival now watched as the alliance she had forged prepared for its ultimate test. The partnership that had seemed to promise stability was about to be subjected to forces that would either validate or destroy it, and Cleopatra understood that no amount of intelligence or preparation could fully control outcomes when empires collided, and the future was written in blood rather than diplomacy. The years following the Parthian disaster were not, as Octavian's propagandists later claimed, years of indolent luxury and Eastern decadence. They were years of patient reconstruction, rebuilding the legions that had been shattered in the mountains of Media, restoring relationships with client kings whose confidence had been shaken by Roman defeat, and gradually assembling the resources for campaigns that might redeem what had been lost. Antony remained in the East, not because he had abandoned Rome, but because the East was where Roman power needed to be exercised, where Parthia still posed a threat, where the wealth that sustained the empire was generated and collected. He governed from Antioch and Alexandria, moving between the ancient Syrian capital and Egypt's Mediterranean jewel, as circumstances required. The administration he oversaw was efficient if unconventional. Roman officials worked alongside Greek secretaries and Egyptian administrators, creating a hybrid bureaucracy that drew on the expertise of all three cultures. Trade flourished under his protection. The roads he maintained carried commerce from India to the Mediterranean. The eastern provinces, which had suffered through decades of civil war and competing warlords, experienced a stability they had not known since before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Cleopatra ruled Egypt during these years, with the assurance of someone whose position had finally achieved something approaching security. The territories Antony had granted expanded her kingdom's reach and revenue. Her children were growing, Caesarion now a young man being trained in kingship, the twins approaching their early years of education, young Ptolemy Philadelphus, a toddler being raised in a palace that served as his entire world. She presided over a court that combined Ptolemaic tradition with the practical awareness that Egypt's future was inextricably bound to Rome's eastern territories and to the general who governed them. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra had evolved beyond its beginnings at Tarsus. Whether it constituted genuine love or merely the deepest form of political partnership, it functioned as marriage in all but Roman law. They appeared together at ceremonies, consulted on decisions affecting both their domains, and planned for a future that assumed their continued collaboration. For Antony, who maintained his technical marriage to Octavia but had not seen her in years, the distinction between legal wife and actual partner had become meaningless. For Cleopatra, the arrangement provided both personal satisfaction and political advantage. She was not merely allied with Rome's eastern commander, but was his acknowledged partner in governance. In 34 BC, after a moderately successful campaign in Armenia that captured that kingdom's ruler and avenged some of the Parthian humiliation, Antony staged a celebration in Alexandria that would provide Octavian with propaganda material for years to come. The event, later called the Donations of Alexandria, was structured as a Roman triumph but held in an Egyptian capital, featuring Roman legionaries and Eastern splendor in equal measure. The captured Armenian king was paraded through Alexandria's streets, and in the gymnasium where Alexander the Great had once trained, Antony presided over a ceremony that redistributed territories and titles among Cleopatra's children. The event was theatre, but theatre with serious political implications. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, a title that emphasized her supremacy among Eastern monarchs. Caesarion, now perhaps 13, was declared King of Kings and legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, a claim that directly challenged Octavian's position as Caesar's adopted son and legal heir. The twins received territories. Alexander Helios was assigned Armenia, Media, and Parthia, the last two not yet conquered but promised as future conquests, while Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. Young Ptolemy, Philadelphus, barely 6, was granted Syria and portions of Asia Minor. The titles were largely symbolic. The children were too young to govern, and the territories remained under Roman military control. But the symbolism mattered enormously. Antony was distributing Roman conquests and future conquests, not to Roman governors or even to client kings of his own choosing, but to the children of Egypt's queen, children who bore the names of Eastern dynasties and embodied the fusion of Roman power with Hellenistic monarchy. The message was clear. The East would be governed not as Roman provinces, subject to Senate oversight, but as kingdoms tied to Rome through family connections and personal loyalty to Antony himself. To observers in Rome, the donations represented everything they feared about Antony's Eastern sojourn. He was no longer acting as Roman magistrate governing conquered territories for the Republic's benefit, but as Eastern monarch distributing kingdoms to his own dynasty. The fact that these children included Cleopatra's son by Caesar, a potential rival to Octavian's own claim to Caesar's legacy, made the threat even more explicit. Antony's vision of Rome's future Eastern administration looked less like traditional Roman governance and more like Alexander's Hellenistic empire, reborn under Roman military power. Octavian, watching from Rome, recognized the opportunity. His propagandists had been portraying Antony as corrupted by Eastern luxury for years. Now they had concrete events to cite. The donations became proof that Antony had abandoned Roman values, that he planned to move the capital to Alexandria, that he intended to make himself king, that most hated of Roman words, with an Egyptian queen as his consort. The fact that Antony maintained Roman administrative structures alongside the theatrical gestures, that he governed effectively even while living among foreign courts, was ignored in favor of the simpler, more frightening narrative. Rome's Eastern commander had been seduced by Egypt's queen and now threatened to transform the Republic into an Oriental despotism. Through 34 and into 33 BC, the propaganda war intensified while both sides prepared for inevitable military conflict. Octavian positioned himself as defender of traditional Roman virtue against Eastern corruption. His supporters in the Senate passed resolutions condemning Antony's actions, questioning his loyalty, and suggesting that he had forfeited his position through his associations and policies. Antony responded with his own denunciations, accusing Octavian of having seized power illegally, of having enriched himself through prescriptions, of maintaining authority only through force rather than legitimate election. The triumvirate, which had been extended at Tarentum for 5 years, expired on December 31st, 33 BC. Both men immediately began maneuvering for the confrontation they had postponed for nearly a decade. Octavian portrayed himself as private citizen, defending the Republic against Eastern tyranny. A curious claim from someone who commanded legions and controlled half the Roman world. Antony claimed to be the legitimate representative of Roman authority in the East, fighting against a usurper who had violated the constitution and murdered fellow citizens in proscriptions. Both narratives contained truth and deception, in measures carefully calculated for political effect. The decisive moment came when Octavian, through means that were almost certainly illegal, obtained Antony's will from the Temple of Vesta, where Roman nobles deposited such documents for safekeeping. The Vestal virgins protested this violation of sacred tradition, but Octavian ignored them and had the will read publicly in the Senate. Its contents, whether authentic or partially fabricated, provided exactly the scandal Octavian needed. It confirmed that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, that he acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's son, and that he made provisions for Cleopatra's children that treated them as heirs to Roman territories. The response in Rome was exactly what Octavian calculated. Even senators who might have sympathized with Antony could not defend a Roman commander who wanted burial in a foreign capital. The notion that Caesarion might be Caesar's legitimate heir threatened Octavian's entire position. The treatment of Cleopatra as partner rather than client offended Roman sensibilities about proper relationships between conquerors and conquered the Senate, guided by Octavian's supporters, declared war, but significantly not on Antony. They declared war on Cleopatra. This distinction was brilliant propaganda. By making Cleopatra the official enemy, Octavian avoided the appearance of starting another Roman civil war. He could claim to be defending Rome against a foreign threat, defending Italy against an Oriental queen who sought to dominate the Mediterranean. Antony's support of Cleopatra thus became treason, aiding Rome's enemy rather than merely disagreeing with fellow Romans about constitutional authority. The fact that this characterization ignored the reality of the situation, that the coming war was absolutely a Roman civil war, the final conflict between the two men who had divided Caesar's legacy between them, mattered less than the narrative it created. As 32 BC progressed, both sides assembled their forces. Antony gathered legions from across the eastern provinces, called on client kings to provide troops, and prepared a fleet that would give him naval superiority in what both sides understood would be a maritime conflict. His strategy was sound: establish bases on the Greek coast, threaten Italy itself, force Octavian to either negotiate or fight a war that would be costly, even in victory. He commanded experienced troops, had ample supplies thanks to Egypt's wealth, and enjoyed the advantage of defending positions he had chosen rather than attacking fortified Italy. But Antony's position carried inherent weaknesses that Octavian's propaganda exploited mercilessly. Many of his Roman officers were uncomfortable fighting alongside Egyptian forces, uncomfortable with the prominent role Cleopatra played in strategic decisions, and increasingly convinced that they were fighting not for Roman interests, but for an Eastern queen's ambitions. Desertions began, not mass defections, but a steady trickle of senior commanders, who concluded that Antony's cause had become too entangled with Egypt to remain truly Roman. Each desertion weakened his forces and provided Octavian with intelligence about his plans. Cleopatra herself became a liability, even as her resources remained essential. Antony needed Egypt's gold, grain, and ships. But every appearance she made at military councils, every ceremony where she stood beside Antony, as equal rather than subordinate, reinforced Octavian's narrative that this was Egypt's war rather than Rome's internal conflict. Antony's Roman soldiers, loyal as they might be to their commander, struggled to reconcile that loyalty with fighting for outcomes that seemed to benefit a foreign monarch more than Roman interests. The propaganda that portrayed Cleopatra as seductress and sorceress, who had bewitched Antony, found fertile ground among men already predisposed to see Eastern influence as corrupting. Through the winter of 33 to 32 BC, as forces assembled and strategies were refined, the Mediterranean world held its breath. Two men who had once called each other allies prepared to destroy each other. Behind them stood centuries of Roman history, the republic that had conquered the Mediterranean through discipline and determination, now reduced to prize in a competition between individual commanders. And beside one of those commanders stood the last queen of Egypt, whose kingdom's fate was bound so completely to Antony's that his defeat would mean her destruction. In Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared for war with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized her entire reign. She ensured that the grain supplies were secure, that the treasury could support sustained military operations, that the fleet was maintained and supplied. She spent time with her children, knowing that the coming months might separate them indefinitely, might expose them to dangers she could not control. Caesarion, now perhaps 16, was old enough to understand what was at stake. The twins, at 8 years old, could sense the tension, even if they could not fully comprehend it. Young Ptolemy, Philadelphus, barely 7, lived in a child's world where the palace was safety and tomorrow was certain. The queen who had navigated 2 decades of Roman civil wars, who had survived exile and siege, who had allied with 2 of Rome's most powerful generals and borne children to both, now faced her greatest test. Everything she had built, her restoration to power, her expansion of Egypt's territories, her children's future, the preservation of Ptolemaic independence, depended on military victory in a war she could not fight herself, but whose outcome she could influence through strategy, resources, and the partnership she had forged with Antony. The strategy they developed called for establishing a strong position in Greece, threatening Italy, and forcing Octavian to either negotiate or fight a campaign where Antony's superior numbers and naval advantage would prove decisive. It was a plan that should have worked, that might have worked, if warfare were purely a matter of logistics and tactics. But wars are won as much by morale and narrative as by soldiers and ships, and in those less tangible dimensions, Octavian had been preparing the ground for years. As spring arrived in 32 BC, the forces that would decide the Mediterranean world's future began moving into position. Antony and Cleopatra sailed with their fleet to Greece, establishing headquarters at Actium on the western coast, where a narrow strait could be defended and from which Italy was visible across a relatively short stretch of sea. The legions were well supplied, the fleet formidable, the positions strong. Victory seemed not merely possible, but probable. But Octavian possessed 2 advantages that would prove more valuable than superior numbers. Marcus Agrippa, his admiral and general whose competence had won every campaign Octavian claimed as his own, and a propaganda narrative that painted this conflict not as Roman civil war, but as civilizational struggle. Rome's virtue against Eastern corruption, Italian manhood against Oriental seduction, the Republic's future against monarchical tyranny. The narrative was simplistic and often false, but it resonated with soldiers who already questioned why they were fighting alongside Egyptian forces, for causes that seemed increasingly foreign to traditional Roman interests. The final confrontation approached across calm Mediterranean waters. 2 visions of Rome's future prepared to collide. Octavian's vision of a restored republic, governed from Italy under a princeps who maintained traditional forms while exercising unprecedented power, and Antony's vision of a Roman Empire that embraced its eastern territories as partners rather than subjects, that governed through collaboration between Roman military power and established Eastern monarchies. Neither vision was particularly republican in the old sense. but one maintained the appearance of continuity, while the other demanded acknowledgement of transformation. In the camps at Actium, as summer of 32 BC turned toward autumn, soldiers drilled and ships were readied, and commanders reviewed plans that would determine whether the next century would see Rome governed from Italy, or whether the center of power might shift east to Alexandria or Antioch. The war that both sides had prepared for through a decade of uneasy peace was finally about to begin, and its outcome would determine not only which man held power, but what kind of power Rome would become. Whether the Eastern dream of fusion between Roman discipline and Hellenistic sophistication would prevail, or whether Rome would remain fundamentally Italian, fundamentally Western, fundamentally hostile to the very Eastern riches and cultures its conquests had made accessible. The lighthouse at Alexandria burned in the harbour, visible to ships that carried supplies and messages between Egypt and Greece. In the palace, Cleopatra had left capable administrators to govern in her absence, had ensured that Caesarion could manage ceremonial duties, had made all the preparations that foresight allowed. Now she waited at Actium beside Antony, her fate and her kingdom's fate, bound to the outcome of battles she could influence but not control, dependent on the courage of soldiers who fought not for Egypt but for the Roman commander who had made Egypt his partner. The Eastern dream that had seemed so solid, so achievable, a Mediterranean world governed through cooperation between Roman power and regional monarchies, where Cleopatra's children might inherit kingdoms and Augustus's adopted heir might find room for Caesar's biological son, now faced its test. The vision that had animated the donations of Alexandria, that had justified years of patient building and careful alliance, would either be validated by victory or erased by defeat. There was no middle ground, no compromise possible. Either Antony and Cleopatra would emerge victorious and reshape Rome's future to include Egypt as partner rather than province, or Octavian would triumph and reduce Egypt to what it had been drifting toward for a generation, another conquered territory, distinguished from others only by its wealth and its memories. The wait for battle was nearly over. The forces were assembled, the strategies prepared, the stakes understood by all involved. What remained was execution, the test of whether plans survived contact with reality, whether narrative could overcome numbers, whether the partnership forged at Tarsus and tempered through years of shared governance could endure the ultimate pressure of military defeat or rise to ultimate vindication through victory. The answer waited across the narrow strait, in the decisions of admirals and the courage of rowers, in the judgment of soldiers and the winds of fate. The Eastern dream stood at its moment of testing, and the last queen of Egypt waited beside her Roman general for the dawn that would determine whether that dream survived or died with them. The narrow strait at Actium should have been defensible, a bottleneck where Antony's larger ships could control the passage, where superior numbers could compensate for any tactical disadvantages, where the combined might of Rome's eastern legions and Egypt's fleet should have been sufficient to repel or destroy any force attempting to break through. The position had been chosen carefully, the fortifications built methodically, and the supplies accumulated through months of preparation. As summer turned toward autumn in 31 BC, the forces gathered there represented the greatest concentration of naval power the Mediterranean had yet witnessed. But warfare is decided by more than positions and numbers. Through the late summer months, as both sides maneuvered and waited, Antony's advantage slowly eroded. Octavian's admiral Marcus Agrippa proved himself master of naval warfare in ways that Antony, fundamentally a land commander, could not match. Agrippa struck at supply lines, captured fortified positions to the south, and gradually tightened a noose around Actium that made the strong position feel increasingly like a trap. The supplies that had seemed abundant in spring dwindled through summer. Disease, that eternal companion of armies in camp, began working through the troops with the relentless efficiency that turned mighty forces into hollow shells. More devastating than tactical setbacks was the continued hemorrhaging of senior commanders. The men who had served Antony for years, who had fought beside him through civil wars and foreign campaigns, began concluding that this war was unwinnable, not because Octavian's forces were superior, but because the cause they served had become too entangled with Egypt, too identified with Cleopatra, too distant from the Roman interests they had spent their lives defending. Lucius Manatius Plancus and Marcus Titius, both consuls and trusted advisors, defected to Octavian's camp, bringing with them detailed knowledge of Antony's plans and the intelligence that his forces were weaker than they appeared. Each desertion struck at morale more than at military capacity. When senior commanders abandoned their posts, the soldiers who remained questioned their own loyalty. If men who had known Antony for decades now judged his cause lost, what did that say about the wisdom of remaining? The defections became self-fulfilling prophecy, each departure making the next more likely, each betrayal weakening the bonds of loyalty that held armies together. Antony's forces remained formidable in absolute terms, but they were corroding from within, their fighting spirit undermined by the growing conviction that they fought for the wrong reasons in service to the wrong alliance. Cleopatra's presence in the military camp, which should have been insignificant, she provided resources but not command, became focal point for resentment and doubt. The Roman soldiers saw her at war councils, saw Antony consulting with her, saw Egyptian ships alongside Roman ones, and questioned whose war they were truly fighting. The propaganda Octavian had been spreading for years found confirmation in what they observed daily. Their commander had indeed become too close to the Egyptian queen, had indeed allowed her influence to shape decisions that should have been purely Roman. The fact that Cleopatra's strategic advice was often sound, that her resources were essential, that her presence represented alliance rather than domination. None of this mattered against the power of narrative that cast her as seductress and Antony as her victim. By September, the situation had become untenable. The strong position had become static trap. Disease and desertion had weakened the forces faster than recruitment could replace them. Supplies, strangled by Agrippa's superior naval maneuvering, were running dangerously low. Antony faced a choice between fighting his way out or surrendering to slow strangulation. The decision was made to attempt a breakout, to gather the fleet, break through Octavian's naval cordon, and retreat to Egypt, where supplies were secure and the campaign could be rebuilt on firmer foundation. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the fleets met in the waters off Actium. The battle that followed would be remembered not for its tactical brilliance or dramatic reversals, but for its strange, inconclusive unfolding and its decisive strategic consequences. Antony commanded larger ships, quinqueremes, and even larger vessels designed to serve as floating fortresses, equipped with towers for archers and catapults that could rain projectiles on enemy vessels. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's command, consisted of smaller, more maneuverable ships that could exploit gaps in enemy formations and whose marines were skilled at close-quarters combat. The engagement began in the morning, with both fleets forming battle lines and probing for advantage. For hours, the battle remained confused, ships ramming and grappling, arrows and javelins filling the air, flames spreading when fireships found targets. Neither side gained decisive advantage, though Agrippa's superior tactics allowed Octavian's forces to maintain better formation and exploit weaknesses as they appeared. Antony fought from his flagship, attempting to direct a battle that had already fragmented into dozens of individual ship-to-ship engagements. Then, at a critical moment in the afternoon, Cleopatra's squadron, 60 ships that carried the war treasury and were positioned in reserve, suddenly raised sail and broke away from the battle. They headed south toward Egypt, their purple sails catching the wind that had shifted to favor retreat rather than continued engagement. What happened next became subject to centuries of debate and interpretation. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's ships departing, broke away from the battle and followed her with a few dozen vessels, abandoning the main fleet that continued fighting without its commander. The ancient sources, most written by Octavian's supporters, portrayed this as romantic tragedy. Antony so besotted with Cleopatra that he abandoned his men to follow his lover into retreat, his military judgment overcome by passion. The narrative served Octavian's propaganda perfectly, proof that Antony had been utterly corrupted by the Egyptian queen, that he valued her more than his soldiers, that his judgment had been destroyed by infatuation. But the truth was almost certainly more complex and more calculated. Cleopatra's withdrawal may have been prearranged, a strategic retreat that preserved the treasury and the core leadership for continued resistance from Egypt. Antony's decision to follow may have been not romantic impulse, but recognition that the battle was already lost, that continuing to fight would result only in his death or capture, and that preserving command authority for future campaigns required surviving the immediate disaster. The main fleet, abandoned by its commander, fought on for hours before surrendering or fleeing, a testament to Roman discipline, but also an indictment of leadership that chose preservation over death with honor. Whatever the motivation, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Antony had lost not merely a battle, but his reputation. A Roman commander did not abandon his troops, did not flee battle, did not prioritize survival over honor. The soldiers and sailors who had fought until their surrender now felt betrayed by the man they had followed. Those who had wavered in their loyalty found their doubts confirmed. The forces that had assembled at Actium to contest for the Mediterranean world's future melted away, some joining Octavian, others simply dispersing to their homes, none believing any longer in the cause that had brought them to Greece. The retreat to Alexandria was not the panicked flight that later chroniclers described, but it was certainly retreat, certainly defeat, acknowledged through action, if not through words. Cleopatra's ships, carrying the treasury, made the voyage without incident. Antony followed, his small remaining fleet, a shadow of the armada that had sailed confidently to Greece months before. They arrived in Alexandria, to a city that had not yet heard the news, that still believed its queen and her Roman ally were fighting successfully in Greece, that had no warning that everything had changed. Cleopatra entered the harbour, with signals suggesting victory, banners flying, music playing, the theatrical presentation that had always been part of her political arsenal. The city celebrated before learning that celebration was premature, before understanding that Actium had been defeat rather than triumph. By the time the truth became clear, she had secured the situation, taken control of the narrative, prepared the city for what was coming, and begun planning for the defense that everyone now understood would be necessary. Antony arrived later, entering the city not as triumphant commander, but as defeated general, whose career had just ended in the water off Greece. The chronicles speak of his depression, his withdrawal, his construction of a small retreat near the harbour, where he could isolate himself from the defeat he struggled to comprehend. Whether this reflected genuine psychological collapse or simply the need for time to process and plan, Antony disappeared from public view for days or weeks, leaving Cleopatra to manage the immediate crisis alone. She managed it with characteristic efficiency. The treasury was secured in the royal quarters. The remaining fleet was pulled into harbour and maintained the legions still loyal to Antony. And there were many, scattered across the eastern provinces, were contacted and urged to gather at Alexandria for a final stand. Fortifications were strengthened, supplies accumulated, and plans made for defense of a city that had withstood siege before and might do so again. If Egypt's independence could not be preserved through victory at sea, perhaps it could be preserved through endurance on land. But even as she planned resistance, Cleopatra also considered alternatives. She investigated the possibility of escaping overland, dragging ships across the isthmus to the Red Sea, and fleeing to India or Arabia, where Roman power could not easily reach. She sent diplomatic feelers to Octavian, exploring what terms might be available for negotiated settlement. She prepared for war while hoping to avoid it, gathered forces while seeking alternatives to using them. It was the desperate flexibility of someone who understood that victory was no longer possible, but believed survival might be. The months between Actium and Octavian's arrival in Egypt, autumn of 31 BC through summer of 30 BC, were spent in this strange limbo. Between resistance and resignation, Antony emerged from his self-imposed isolation, gathered such forces as remained loyal, and prepared to defend the kingdom he had helped preserve through a decade of Eastern governance. He and Cleopatra created a new society, dark mirror of their earlier inimitable livers. They called it the Partners in Death, a circle of friends who swore to die together rather than surrender to Octavian. The names suggested resignation, dressed as defiance, acceptance of inevitable defeat combined with determination to face it with style. They spent the winter in Alexandria, conducting the business of a kingdom under siege. Caesarion, now perhaps 17, was old enough to participate in councils and understand that his mother was preparing for outcomes that did not include her survival. The younger children, the twins, now 9, Ptolemy, Philadelphus 7, lived in a palace that maintained routines, even as everything around it prepared for catastrophe. Life continued because life always does, even when the ending is visible on the horizon. Cleopatra made one final attempt to secure her children's future. She sent Caesarion south toward Ethiopia and beyond, carrying treasure that might allow him to escape Octavian's reach and perhaps establish himself somewhere beyond Roman power. The twins and young Ptolemy remained with her, too young to travel such distances, too valuable as hostages or propaganda tools to be easily released. Her son by Caesar departed on a journey that would end, though she could not yet know it, in betrayal and execution. In the spring of 30 BC, Octavian's forces finally arrived. They came from 2 directions, from the west through Libya and from the east through Syria, pincer movement that gave Antony no single defensive position to hold. The legions that had once followed him now marched under Octavian's banners. The commanders who had shared his campaigns now served his enemy. The client kings who had supported him now scrambled to demonstrate loyalty to Rome's obvious victor. Antony attempted one final cavalry engagement outside Alexandria, a sortie that enjoyed brief success before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. His troops, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, broke and fled. When he returned to the city, he learned that his fleet, the last significant force he commanded, had surrendered without fighting. The sailors and marines, deciding that continued resistance was pointless sacrifice rather than honorable duty. The army garrison that defended Alexandria's walls melted away, individual soldiers concluding that their oaths had been fulfilled, and their duty was now to survival rather than lost causes. In the space of days, everything collapsed. The forces that should have defended Egypt disappeared through desertion or surrender. The allies who should have reinforced Alexandria sent messages of regret and pledges of loyalty to Octavian. The treasury that should have funded continued resistance was trapped in a city that could no longer be defended. Antony and Cleopatra found themselves ruling a kingdom that existed only within palace walls, commanding forces that had ceased to follow orders, planning resistance that no one believed was possible. Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum, a substantial structure she had been constructing near the palace, designed as her eventual tomb, but built solidly enough to serve as fortress. She took with her treasure, servants, and the determination to control at least the manner of her ending. If she could no longer control anything else, word was sent to Antony, though whether by intention or error the accounts disagree, that she was dead, that she had taken her own life rather than face capture. Antony, receiving this message in the palace quarters, where he had been preparing for final battle, decided that life without Cleopatra and life as Octavian's captive were both unacceptable. He ordered his servant to kill him. When the man killed himself instead, Antony took his own sword and drove it into his stomach. Not instantly fatal, but mortal nonetheless. The wound that would kill him slowly rather than mercifully. Then came word that Cleopatra lived, that she remained barricaded in the mausoleum. Antony ordered himself carried there, and his men complied, taking their dying commander through Alexandria's streets to the building where she had fortified herself. Cleopatra refused to open the sealed doors, fearing Octavian's soldiers might force entry if the barriers were removed. Instead, Antony was hauled up through a window, his blood leaving trails on the stone as his soldiers and servants pulled him inside the mausoleum. He died in her arms, or so the later accounts claimed, died speaking words of consolation or advice, died as Roman commanders were supposed to die, by his own hand rather than enemies, though the circumstances made the death more pathetic than heroic. Cleopatra washed his body herself, prepared it for burial with her own hands, and mourned with a grief that was recorded as genuine whether or not romance had been the foundation of their partnership. She had lost her ally, her partner in governance, the father of 3 of her children, and the last barrier between her kingdom and Octavian's triumph. With Antony's death, the final pretense ended. There was no more resistance to organize, no more forces to rally, no more possibilities to explore. What remained was only the question of how the ending would be conducted. Octavian's soldiers captured her in the mausoleum, exactly how varies in the accounts, but the result was imprisonment. She was kept under guard, but treated with formal respect, housed in the palace rather than in cells, allowed servants and some dignity. Octavian himself came to see her, the only meeting between Caesar's adopted heir and Caesar's former lover, between the man who now ruled the entire Roman world and the woman who had tried to preserve Egypt's independence through 2 decades of that world's civil wars. What they discussed in that meeting remained private, though both understood the parameters. Octavian needed Cleopatra alive for his triumph. She would be the centerpiece of celebrations that would dwarf anything Rome had seen, the living embodiment of Eastern power brought low by Roman virtue. Cleopatra understood that survival meant being paraded through Rome in chains, displayed to jeering crowds, transformed from queen to prisoner, before being strangled in the traditional conclusion to triumphal processions. This fate, this specific humiliation, was the one outcome she had spent her entire reign trying to avoid. She requested permission to visit Antony's tomb, to perform the funeral rites one final time. Octavian granted this, perhaps from courtesy, perhaps believing that a woman under guard could pose no threat. She went to the tomb, spoke to the dead, and according to later accounts declared that she would not give Octavian the satisfaction of her captivity. When she returned to her chambers, she requested food, a basket of figs from the countryside, a small comfort in circumstances that offered little comfort. What happened next became one of history's most famous deaths, endlessly depicted in art and drama, though the actual details remain uncertain. The traditional account claims that an wesp, a small Egyptian cobra, was hidden in the basket of figs, that Cleopatra allowed it to bite her, and that she died from its venom. Modern historians suggest that poison was more likely, perhaps hidden in a hollow hairpin or in a cosmetic, something that could be applied or ingested without requiring successful smuggling of a living snake past guards who would have been watching carefully. The method mattered less than the meaning. Cleopatra chose death over captivity, chose to die as Egypt's queen rather than live as Rome's prisoner. She dressed in her royal regalia, the robes that signified pharaonic authority, the ornaments that marked divine kingship, and arranged herself on a golden couch as though presiding over court rather than yielding to mortality. Two of her most faithful servants, Iris and Charmian, died with her, whether from the same poison or from solidarity, ensuring that she would not face death alone. When Octavian's soldiers entered her chambers, they found her already cold, arrayed in state, dead by her own hand in a final assertion of autonomy. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years, had borne children to two of Rome's most powerful generals, had navigated her kingdom through decades of Rome's civil wars, and had come closer than any other foreign monarch to bending Rome's destiny to accommodate Egypt's survival as independent power. She had failed, but the failure was magnificent, a testament to intelligence and will, deployed against overwhelming force, a demonstration that even doomed causes could be pursued with style and courage. Octavian, despite being denied his triumph's centerpiece, honored her final wish. He allowed her to be buried beside Antony, in the mausoleum where they had both made their final stand, with funeral rites that acknowledged her royal status. The gesture was perhaps respect for a worthy adversary, perhaps simply recognition that she had already won the battle for how she would be remembered. Let her have the burial she chose. Octavian had won everything else. The lighthouse at Alexandria's harbour still burned, but the kingdom it had guided for 3 centuries was finished. The Ptolemaic dynasty that began with Alexander's general ended with Cleopatra's death. Egypt, which had been independent kingdom, or at least autonomous client for all of recorded history, became a Roman province, annexed directly to Octavian's control, too valuable to be entrusted to the Senate, too rich to be governed like other territories. The grain that had fed Egypt's people would now feed Rome's masses. The gold that had maintained pharaonic court would fill imperial coffers. The independence that Cleopatra had fought to preserve was extinguished, not to be restored for 2,000 years. In the palace gardens, where she had played as child and studied as princess and ruled as queen, the flowers bloomed without regard to politics or empires. The Nile, indifferent to dynasties, continued its annual flood. The Mediterranean lapped at Alexandria's shores with the same rhythm it had kept since the city's founding. But the voice that had spoken in 9 languages, the intelligence that had matched wits with Caesar and Antony, the will that had kept Egypt independent when independence became impossible, that voice was silenced, that intelligence extinguished, that will finally overcome by forces even genius could not defeat. The last queen of Egypt died as she had lived, on her own terms, with style, refusing submission, even when submission was the only pragmatic choice. The dying dynasty had produced one final, brilliant ruler, and she had exhausted every possibility before accepting that some battles cannot be won. In death she achieved what life had finally denied. She would be remembered as she chose to be remembered, as queen rather than captive, as pharaoh rather than prisoner, as the woman who had defied Rome for 2 decades before Rome's overwhelming power finally prevailed. The date was August 12th, 30 BC, though the significance of that particular day would only become clear in retrospect. In the palace quarters where Cleopatra had spent her final hours, Octavian's soldiers found a scene that was both tableau and statement. The queen arranged in death with the precision she had brought to every aspect of her reign. Her servants Eros and Charmian lay nearby. Whether they had died first or followed their mistress into darkness, no one could determine with certainty. What was certain was that Egypt's last independent ruler had chosen her own ending, had refused the humiliation Octavian intended, and had transformed defeat into a final assertion of autonomy. Octavian, informed of her death, responded with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. He had been denied the centerpiece of his planned triumph. The living queen paraded through Rome's streets would have been proof complete of Rome's supremacy over the East, visible vindication of his propaganda about Oriental threats and Roman virtue. A dead queen, however dignified in death, provided no such spectacle. Yet even in death, she had demonstrated the quality that had made her formidable, the ability to control narrative even when controlling events was no longer possible. She would be remembered as queen who chose death over submission, not as captive displayed for Roman entertainment. He ordered a full investigation into her death, questioning guards and servants, searching for the method, asp, poison, or some other means. The accounts that emerged were confused and contradictory, suggesting either successful deception or genuine uncertainty. The guards insisted no snake had entered. The servants who survived spoke of the basket of figs, but could not or would not explain how poison might have been concealed. In the end, Octavian accepted the result, if not the explanation. She was dead, and whether by venom or toxin mattered less than the political implications of that death. The funeral he permitted was generous, even magnificent, a recognition that magnanimity toward defeated enemies was cheaper than vengeance and appeared more noble. Cleopatra was buried beside Antony, with full royal honors, the ceremonies blending Egyptian and Greek traditions as her reign had done. The priests who had proclaimed her pharaoh now performed the rites that released her to the afterlife. The courtiers who had served her attended in mourning that was genuine for some, performative for others, and universally aware that an era had ended. The mausoleum that received their bodies, both Antony's and Cleopatra's, stood as monument to the partnership that had defined the Eastern Mediterranean's politics for nearly a decade, and to the defeat that had finally ended that partnership and Egypt's independence together. But death, while it ended Cleopatra's story, did not end the stories of those whose fates she had tried to secure. Her children, the living embodiments of her alliances and ambitions, now faced the judgment of a victor who needed to eliminate threats while avoiding the appearance of unnecessary cruelty. The decisions Octavian made regarding them reveal much about Roman political calculation and the particular dangers that came with being descended from powerful parents. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, represented the most dangerous threat to Octavian's position. He was perhaps 17, old enough to be rallying point for those who opposed Octavian's rule, and his claim to be Caesar's biological son directly challenged Octavian's legitimacy as Caesar's adopted heir. Cleopatra had sent him south with treasure, hoping he might escape to India or Ethiopia, might find sanctuary beyond Rome's reach. But Caesarion's tutor, either through genuine belief that Octavian would show mercy or through bribery, convinced the young man to return to Alexandria, assuring him that the new master of Egypt would honor his royal status. The assurance was betrayal. When Caesarion returned, Octavian's advisors presented their calculation with brutal clarity. Too many Caesars is not a good thing. The young man, who might have been Julius Caesar's only biological son, who had been proclaimed King of Kings in the donations of Alexandria, who represented the possibility of a Ptolemaic Julian dynasty bridging east and west, was executed quietly, without trial or ceremony. His death was reported as regrettable necessity rather than murder. He had been caught attempting armed resistance, or he had been involved in plots, or simply his existence was incompatible with stable governance. The explanations varied, but the result was consistent. Caesar's possible son died so that Caesar's adopted son could rule unchallenged. The fate of Cleopatra's younger children was surprisingly merciful, testament to Octavian's understanding that dead children made poor propaganda, while living children raised with proper Roman values could demonstrate his clemency. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, now 10 years old, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus, barely 8, were taken from Egypt to Rome. They were not treated as prisoners, but as wards, placed in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister, who raised them alongside her own children with a dignity that spoke well of her character. Octavia, who had been displaced by Cleopatra in Antony's affections, who had every reason to resent the children of her husband's Egyptian lover, instead raised them as her responsibility. They received education appropriate to their status, were taught Latin and Greek, participated in Roman society as members of a distinguished household. The paradox was striking. The children of Rome's defeated enemies were raised by the woman their father had abandoned in the household of the man who had destroyed their mother's kingdom, yet they survived where so many others did not, and survival itself was victory of a kind. Of the three, only Cleopatra Selene's later life is well documented. She was eventually married to Juba II, King of Mauritania, a client kingdom in North Africa, far from Egypt, but still within the sphere Cleopatra had tried to preserve. The marriage was political arrangement, but it proved successful. Cleopatra Selene became queen, ruled alongside her husband with competence that echoed her mother's governance, and named her own son Ptolemy, keeping the dynasty's name alive, even when the dynasty itself was extinct. She commissioned coins bearing her image that deliberately recalled her mother's iconography, maintained cultural connections to Egypt's Hellenistic traditions, and governed as monarch rather than mere consort. In her, something of Cleopatra's legacy survived: intelligence, capability, and the understanding that queens could rule as effectively as kings. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappeared from historical record, their fates unrecorded. They may have died young from disease or accident, or they may have lived quiet lives in comfortable obscurity, their royal blood neutralized by distance from power. Their silence in the chronicles suggests that they never threatened Octavian's order, never attempted to reclaim their mother's kingdom, never became focal points for Eastern resistance to Roman rule. Whether this reflected contentment with their circumstances, or simply the impossibility of challenging Rome's dominance, no evidence survives to clarify. Egypt itself underwent transformation, as complete as the dynasty's extinction. Octavian annexed it not as ordinary province subject to senatorial governance, but as his personal domain, governed by a prefect who answered directly to him, rather than to Senate oversight. The decision reflected Egypt's unique value: its grain-fed Rome's populace, its wealth-filled imperial coffers, and its strategic position controlled access to Red Sea trade routes. Such a resource could not be entrusted to ambitious senators who might use Egypt's wealth to challenge imperial authority. Egypt became the emperor's private estate, its revenues his personal income, its administration his direct responsibility. The change was profound but gradual in its visible effects. The Nile still flooded annually, spreading black silt across fields that had known agriculture for 4,000 years. The farmers who worked those fields paid taxes to Roman prefects instead of Ptolemaic officials, but the agricultural rhythm that sustained them continued unchanged. Alexandria remained a great city, its library still attracting scholars despite its diminishment, its harbour still connecting Mediterranean commerce. The temples continued their ancient rites, though now Roman governors, rather than pharaohs, appeared in their dedication ceremonies. Egypt endured, but it endured as province rather than kingdom, as resource rather than power, as memory rather than presence. The transition from Ptolemaic to Roman administration demonstrated both continuity and rupture. The bureaucratic machinery the Ptolemies had refined over 3 centuries was largely maintained. The Romans were practical enough to recognize that functioning systems should be preserved rather than replaced. Greek remained the administrative language, Egyptian the speech of common people, and the hybrid culture that had characterized Alexandria continued to flourish. But the political center had shifted irrevocably from local dynasties to distant emperor, from Memphis and Alexandria to Rome. Egypt's governors were no longer kings who might develop independent policies, but were officials who implemented directives, administrators rather than rulers, managers rather than monarchs. In Rome, Octavian celebrated his triumph in 29 BC with spectacles that commemorated his victories over Antony and Cleopatra, without quite naming them as enemies. The fiction that he had defeated foreign queen rather than fellow Roman had to be maintained. An effigy of Cleopatra was paraded through the streets, a substitute for the living queen who had denied him that pleasure. The crowds cheered the demonstration of Roman superiority, and Octavian used the occasion to cement his position as sole authority in a republic that existed increasingly in name only. Within a few years, he would accept the title Augustus and transform that republic into principate, a system that maintained republican forms while concentrating power in one man's hands. Ironic fulfillment of what he had accused Antony and Cleopatra of planning. The propaganda that had portrayed Cleopatra as seductress, sorceress, and oriental threat continued after her death, hardening into accepted narrative Roman poets, dependent on imperial patronage, wrote verses that depicted her as everything Rome feared about the East: luxury corrupting virtue, foreign influence polluting Roman purity, female sexuality as political weapon. Horace, Virgil, and Propertius all contributed to this portrait, creating the image that would dominate for centuries. Cleopatra, as dangerous woman whose beauty and cunning had almost destroyed Rome, whose ambitions had threatened to move the empire's center eastward, whose death had saved Roman civilization from Oriental corruption. Yet even in their condemnation, these poets could not quite erase the fascination she inspired. They wrote of her intelligence, her linguistic abilities, her charisma, qualities that made her dangerous precisely because they were genuine rather than illusory. The woman who emerged from their verses was a complicated figure, simultaneously victim of her own ambitions, an architect of her own fate, simultaneously tool of Antony's Eastern dreams and their instigator, simultaneously foreign threat and worthy adversary. The propaganda required her to be monster, but the facts kept suggesting she was merely formidable woman operating in circumstances where gender made power more difficult but not impossible to obtain. The historical reality that gradually emerged from beneath the propaganda's distortions revealed a ruler of considerable capability. Cleopatra had governed Egypt for 21 years, longer than many Roman emperors would manage. She had maintained her kingdom's independence through 2 decades of Rome's civil wars, period when client monarchs fell with regularity and provinces were redistributed like game pieces. She had formed alliances with 2 of Rome's most powerful generals, had borne children who might have inherited both Eastern kingdoms and Western empire, and had come closer than any foreign monarch to bending Rome's destiny to accommodate partnership rather than domination. Her linguistic abilities were remarkable for any monarch. Speaking 9 languages allowed her to negotiate directly with Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Jews, Syrians, Ethiopians, Arabians, and others whose cooperation she needed. This was not ornamental accomplishment, but practical tool that gave her advantages in diplomacy that others could not match. Where other rulers required interpreters who might mistranslate or manipulate, Cleopatra heard and spoke for herself, building relationships that transcended the formal requirements of alliance. Her governance of Egypt demonstrated competence in administration that rivaled her diplomatic skills. She managed complex irrigation systems, maintained religious institutions that legitimized her rule, ensured grain production, fed both Egypt and Rome, and navigated between Greek culture and Egyptian tradition with fluency that her Ptolemaic predecessors had rarely achieved. The Egypt she ruled was stable internally, prosperous within the constraints of post-Civil War economy, and culturally vibrant despite political subordination to Rome's interests. Her failure was not failure of ability, but failure of circumstance. She ruled kingdom that had already lost the military power necessary for true independence, that survived within Roman sphere through combination of wealth and geography that made direct conquest more expensive than indirect control. She maintained that precarious independence for 2 decades through intelligence and adaptation, but when Rome's civil wars finally ended and one man ruled entire Mediterranean world, no amount of intelligence could preserve autonomy that existed only in gaps between competing Roman factions. Her defeat was inevitable once Octavian consolidated power, not because she lacked ability, but because Egypt lacked the military strength to resist unified Rome, and no amount of diplomatic brilliance could substitute for legions she did not command. The manner of her death contributed significantly to her legend. By choosing poison or asp rather than captivity, by dying in royal regalia rather than chains, by transforming defeat into final assertion of autonomy, she ensured that memory would preserve her as queen rather than prisoner. The image of Cleopatra dying on golden couch, crowned and robed, refusing submission even when submission was the only pragmatic choice, resonated through centuries. Artists painted it, dramatists staged it, poets celebrated it. The death became more famous than much of the life, the final gesture overshadowing many of the careful political calculations that had preceded it. Her relationship with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, while certainly involving personal dimensions that no historical record can fully recover, was fundamentally about preserving Egypt's independence through alliance with Rome's most powerful figures. The characterization of these relationships as primarily romantic or sexual, seduction as political weapon, says more about Roman anxieties about female power and Eastern influence than about Cleopatra's actual strategies. She allied with generals who could protect Egypt, bore children who might inherit kingdoms, and maintained partnerships that served both parties' interests. That these alliances also involved personal relationships was neither surprising nor particularly relevant to their political function. The children she bore to these unions represented more than personal connections. They were diplomatic bonds, potential heirs to hybrid dynasty that might bridge Eastern and Western power structures. Caesarion, as Caesar's son, could have united Julian and Ptolemaic claims. The twins with Antony embodied the fusion of Roman military power with Hellenistic monarchy that characterized Antony's Eastern vision. These children were political instruments as well as personal legacies, part of long-term strategy to preserve Egypt through generational alliances rather than temporary treaties. That strategy failed with Actium's defeat, but its sophistication demonstrated Cleopatra's understanding of how dynasties preserved themselves through centuries of dangerous politics. The Ptolemies had survived 300 years through strategic marriages, careful alliances, and willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. Cleopatra employed these same methods in context where Rome had become the only power that mattered, where survival required integration rather than independence, where preserving Egypt meant acknowledging its subordination while maintaining its distinct identity. The historical assessment of Cleopatra has shifted dramatically over centuries, as different eras brought different concerns to their evaluation of her reign. Roman sources, written by victors who needed to justify her defeat, emphasized seduction and Oriental corruption. Medieval Christians, uncomfortable with powerful women, cast her as cautionary tale about female ambition and sexual license. Renaissance dramatists found in her story material for tragedy about love conflicting with duty. Enlightenment historians debated her political acumen versus personal passion. Modern scholars, with access to Egyptian sources and less investment in Roman perspectives, have increasingly emphasized her capabilities as ruler, her intelligence as strategist, and her achievement in maintaining Egyptian independence for 2 decades, in circumstances that made independence nearly impossible. What emerges from this accumulated scholarship is portrait of capable ruler operating in impossible circumstances, a woman educated beyond her era's expectations, intelligent enough to compete with history's most formidable men, determined enough to exhaust every possibility before accepting defeat. She was neither the monster of Roman propaganda nor the romantic heroine of later drama, but something more interesting. A pragmatic politician who understood power's mechanisms, employed available tools without apology, and maintained her kingdom's autonomy longer than any reasonable assessment of relative strength suggested was possible. Her legacy extended beyond her lifetime through multiple channels. Her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, carried Ptolemaic culture to Mauritania, where it influenced North African civilization for generations. The administrative systems she maintained in Egypt continued under Roman rule, their efficiency making Egypt one of empire's most valuable provinces for centuries. The cultural synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman influences that characterized Alexandrian civilization, under her rule, continued to shape Mediterranean intellectual life long after her death. The library, though diminished, survived to preserve and transmit ancient knowledge. The harbour she maintained continued to serve as link between Mediterranean commerce and Red Sea trade. More subtly, she demonstrated that female rulers could govern as effectively as male ones, that queens were not merely consorts or regents, but could be monarchs in their own right. This lesson was often forgotten or ignored, but it remained available in historical record for those who sought examples of women exercising power competently. Every subsequent female ruler who needed to justify her authority could point to Cleopatra. Controversial figure, certainly, but indisputably capable one, as precedent for women's capacity to govern. The transformation of historical Cleopatra into legendary Cleopatra began almost immediately after her death, and has continued through every generation, since each era recreates her according to its own concerns, Romans saw dangerous foreigner. Christians saw sinful temptress. Renaissance saw tragic heroine. Moderns see capable politician. The historical figure becomes less important than the cultural function she serves, screen onto which each generation projects its anxieties about power, gender, East versus West, passion versus duty, autonomy versus submission. Yet beneath these projections, the historical Cleopatra remains recoverable, if incompletely. The coins she minted show her as she chose to be seen, not as beauty, but as monarch, profile deliberately echoing her predecessors, emphasizing legitimacy and authority rather than personal charm. The administrative documents that survived show her governance was competent and detail-oriented. The accounts of her linguistic abilities, her participation in ceremonies, her patronage of learning all suggest ruler who took governance seriously and performed it effectively. In the end, Cleopatra's story is not primarily about romance or seduction, not about decline or decadence, but about the last flicker of an independent Egypt before Rome's overwhelming power finally extinguished it. She was the final pharaoh, last in a line stretching back 3,000 years, ruling kingdom that had known civilization when Rome was village of mud huts. That she preserved that kingdom's independence for 2 decades in the face of Rome's expansion was achievement that no amount of propaganda could diminish. That she finally lost was inevitable. Geography, economics, and military strength all favored Rome, but that she fought intelligently and lost on her own terms was testament to abilities that deserved better circumstances than history provided. The lighthouse at Alexandria's harbour continued to burn for centuries after her death, guiding ships to a city that remained great even under Roman administration. The Nile continued its annual flood, indifferent to the change from Ptolemaic to Roman governance. The temples where she had been, proclaimed pharaoh, maintained their rituals, adapting prayers to acknowledge new rulers while preserving ceremonies older than any dynasty Egypt endured, as it always had, absorbing conquerors and outlasting empires through sheer persistence of landscape and culture that could be ruled but never quite controlled. Cleopatra died as she had lived, on her own terms, with intelligence, with style, refusing submission even when submission offered survival. The last queen of Egypt, the final Ptolemy, the woman who had partnered with Rome's greatest generals and borne children who might have ruled both East and West, ended her life as she had conducted it, calculating options, choosing the best available path, and executing that choice with the decisiveness that had characterized her reign. She failed ultimately, but the failure was magnificent, testament to human will exercised against impossible odds, to intelligence deployed in service of doomed cause, to determination that exhausted every possibility before accepting defeat. The dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries ended with her death, but the memory of that dynasty and its last brilliant queen would outlive the empire that defeated her. Rome conquered Egypt, but Cleopatra conquered imagination. And in the end, immortality belongs not to empires, but to those who shape how empires are remembered. The last queen of Egypt died in 30 BC, but her story, told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, condemned and celebrated, continues, a reminder that some defeats echo longer than most victories, and that intelligence and courage, even in service of lost causes, merit recognition across the centuries that separate their exercise from our remembrance. The woman who had studied languages in palace gardens, who had been exiled and returned in triumph, who had loved 2 of Rome's greatest men and borne them children, who had ruled Egypt through decades of Rome's civil wars, who had navigated between cultures and powers with grace that made survival seem possible, even when it was not. That woman became legend, and in becoming legend achieved a kind of victory that transcends military defeat. Egypt became Roman province, but Cleopatra became eternal. Her name synonymous with intelligence, power, beauty, tragedy, and the doomed yet magnificent attempt to preserve autonomy in an age of empire. The last light faded from the lighthouse. The last breath left her body. The last Ptolemy passed into history. But the story remained, preserved and polished by centuries of retelling, a reminder that even in defeat there can be dignity, even in failure there can be achievement, and even when all is lost, the manner of losing matters. Cleopatra, last queen of Egypt, died young, but ruled well, failed ultimately, but fought brilliantly, lost her kingdom, but preserved her legend, and in that preservation found the immortality that even the greatest empires cannot guarantee their rulers. The wind from the harbour carried salt and memory across the city she had ruled, across the palace where she had governed, across the mausoleum where she lay beside the general who had been her partner and her fate. The Mediterranean lapped at shores it had touched since before civilization began, indifferent to dynasties and empires, to victories and defeats, to the rise and fall of kingdoms. But on those shores, in the memories of those who knew her story and those who would learn it across coming centuries, Cleopatra remained, queen, strategist, mother, legend, an enduring reminder that some lives, however brief, shape the imagination of ages to follow. The dying dynasty had produced its final, brilliant ruler, and though she died in defeat, she died undefeated, a distinction that history would recognize even when her contemporaries could not. The last queen of Egypt passed into darkness on an August afternoon in 30 BC, but the light she cast, intelligence struggling against circumstance, capability deployed in impossible situation, humanity asserting autonomy even when autonomy became impossible, that light has never quite been extinguished and perhaps never will be. In that persistence of memory, across 2,000 years of empire and republic, monarchy and democracy, east and west, her greatest victory lies, not in what she achieved, but in what she attempted, and in how she is remembered for attempting it.